Transit Service Delivery Advisory Committee to order for our meeting of May 13th, 2022. My name is John McGlennon. I'm a member of the James City County Board of Supervisors, Chair of the Board of Supervisors in James City County, and chairing TSDAC. I serve on the committee as a representative of the Virginia Association of Counties. Now, our Vice Chair to introduce herself.
Good morning, everyone. Cindy Mester, City of Falls Church Deputy City Manager. As John indicated, Vice Chair of TSDAC. Very easy job under his able leadership. And I am the DML representative.
Good morning, Jamie Jackson, Director of Public Transit and Transportation for Fredericksburg Regional Transit in the City of Fredericksburg. So good morning.
Sam Sink, Director of Planning and Scheduling at GRTC here in Richmond. I represent VTA.
I'm Dan Sonnenklar. I am a statewide transit planning manager here.
Brian Booth, I'm the Director of Transit at Blacksburg Transit and representing CTAB.
Jen DeBrule, I'm the Acting Director of DRPT.
Good morning, Tanya Garriswell, Chief Financial Officer, DRPT.
And our staff.
Hi, everyone. Lauren Magnato. I'm a statewide program manager at DRPT. And good morning. I'm Tiffany DeBenski. I'm a statewide transit planning manager here in Richmond as well.
And I'm going to introduce Mary Olivia because she is a new addition to our team on our policy and communications team. So you'll be seeing her periodically. She's helping us out with all kinds of communications and grant applications and all kinds of things to help advance our program here at DRPT.
We also have participating a couple of members remotely. Let me first ask Dr. Smoot if you would introduce yourself.
Dr. Smoot, are you there? Oh, I think you're muted. Yeah, I think you're showing up as self-muted.
Good morning.
There you go.
Okay, Ray Smoot, member of Commonwealth Transportation Board from Montgomery County.
Thank you, Dr. Smoot. And Kate Mattice.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. So Kate Mattice, I'm the Executive Director of the Northern Virginia Transportation Commission, representing the Virginia Transit Association. And it is good to see everybody on the screen. I can't wait to see you all in person soon.
We hope you're feeling well, Kate. And I understand Grant Sparks is also joining us virtually, again, as a result of the quarantining related to COVID. Morning, Grant.
He may be trying to wrangle several.
Okay, well, we'll go ahead.
I'm pretty sure what we're doing today is a little easier than
We'll move on to our first item on the, or second item on the agenda, fiscal year 23 draft 6-year improvement program and agency budget. Tanya Darashah.
Perfect. Good morning. I'm actually going to stand, so please let me know if you can hear me virtually.
Sounds good.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So I will be presenting the draft set, 23 draft set and agency budget. This was a presentation, actually a little snippet of a presentation that I gave to the CTV on April 19th. So this graph is a 5-year comparison of the SIP allocation. And this is for total funds. So this includes the state, the local match, and the federal funds. The total SIP for FY 23 to 28, as you can see, is a total of $6.3 billion. As you can see, it's $1.5 billion for rail and $4.7 billion for transit. But just stepping through this really quickly, the thing that kind of pops out to me very quickly is this dip at FY 21 to 26, and that is due to COVID, obviously, and uncertainty of revenue. So we were approved and instructed to prepare a 2-year SIP as opposed to a 6-year SIP. So that's the reason for that drastic decrease in FY 21 to 26. FY 22 to 27 is actually a pretty steep increase outside of it just being a 2-year SIP. And that is because this is the first time that you requested and were approved funding for Northern Virginia. And then moving to FY 23 and 28, there's also a pretty substantial increase in to FY 22 and 27, especially for transit, and that is primarily because of the one-time, and I do repeat, one-time uptick in revenue that will be impacting FY 22 as well as FY 23. So instead of providing you another snapshot of the revenue estimates by program for total funds, we wanted to focus on the state funds because, of course, the local match and the federal match we don't really have that much control over. But for the state funds, we're taking it purely from our revenue. So just stepping through this really quickly, you will notice that there is a decrease from FY 23 to FY 24. And that is because of a percentage change in the allocation of funds that were going into the Commonwealth Mass Transit Fund, pursuant to the Code of Virginia. As well, there is that one-time or last one-time funding of the $50 million for FRIA. So that's being added in FY 23, and then starting in FY 24, it's going to come off the top of the Commonwealth Mass Transit Fund. So that's going to decrease the funding that's going into the program. So that's the reason for that. We're just stepping through this, just slightly, understanding that for the HIP allocation, FY 23 is based on the approved grantee applications, but then for the out years, it's based on just the revenue that we've received, the estimates that we've received from the Department of Transportation. Okay, sorry about that.
Can I add one thing?
Absolutely.
So we've written this little bubble in 22 and 23 with the revenues. I keep calling it the bubble. Nothing's breaking. It's just kind of a reset of the revenue forecast that we had through COVID and some changes in the formula as the omnibus bill fully implements in fiscal 24. So if you look at the $115 million for operating, that's still $15 million a year more than we had for operating overall before the omnibus bill, before COVID. So if we go back in the Wayback Time machine, we're still on a trajectory that is much better than it was before the omnibus bill. I just think we just need to keep these couple of years in context. They're a little bit off. So
22, 23, and 24.
Yes. And then
sorry, and I'm trying to figure out how to raise a hand, but
go ahead, Kate.
Go ahead, Kate.
yeah, do the projections that you have here also anticipate now the new changes to the elimination of the grocery tax?
No,
Are those reflected in the estimates or not?
This does reflect the elimination of the grocery tax, but it does not include the gas tax rollback.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions about this slide? Okay, so as I discussed earlier, the SIP is the allocation of the grantee application, the approved grantee applications. However, our budget is based on our forecast of projected payments or literally cash out the door for our over 2,000 projects. And so approximately, as you can see, approximately 78% of our entire, agency budget is on the transit program, which is pretty substantial. And in total, we're projecting to spend $1.1 billion for FY 23, of which 72% of the funding source is from the Transportation Trust Fund, which makes sense. 78% of it is actually funding the transit program. All right. Any questions there? All right. Key takeaways. Number one, fly in like that. That was not planned. Surprise. So the FY 23 to 28 increase in revenue for the SIP in FY 23 to 28 is due to the uptick in estimated revenue, that one-time revenue that we were talking about for FY 22 and 23. Number two, the decrease in state-only revenue from FY 23 to 24 is just due to the percentage change in the allocation of funds that were coming from the Commonwealth Mass Transit Fund, and the fact that the $50 million in FRIA will now come off the top starting in FY24. And last, that we'll be returning back to pre-pandemic revenue trends, still slightly higher for FY24 to 28. And that's it. Keeping it brief.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for the presentation. Very informative. Does anybody have any questions?
To verify that, just so moving forward, when we're looking at, I'll just say for individual entities and or overall, we could be looking at FY23 dollars that we receive as kind of what our baseline is moving forward.
So the baseline will be really there's a one-time increase in FY23. You really should probably be looking at FY24.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. Jennifer?
Yes, sir. Go ahead, Dr. Smoot.
In item 3, return to pre-pandemic revenue trends, is that basically fair revenue?
I think the point there is the amount of money that's going through the program to things like transit operating and capital is going to return to kind of the pre-pandemic levels. They've gone down and they've gone up over the past couple of years. So they're going to go back to more of that steady state where we see a slight increase in that operating fund each year. It's not so much about their ridership or their fare box revenue, but those are also going up as well.
At what point will ridership become a consideration in budgeting?
So we're going to get into that today.
Okay, we can do it later. Just wait.
We're going to talk about that later today because ridership is a factor in our formula, but we've been in kind of a holding pattern on how that formula is applied for the past couple of years, and so we've got to look at how we step back out of that. But ridership recovery, I think, is multi-year. It's a multi-year exercise ahead of us.
Any other questions? Yeah.
I guess just to confirm, the revenue projections that we're looking at FY24 is sort of the forward look. Grocery tax is already accounted for, you deducted. Motor fuel tax as is. And then I assume that like the latest announcement that just came out today was the big uptick in state revenue. We're not projecting any of that. Saying,
But we have not received any updated revenue projections from the Department of Taxation.
Governor.
Right.
Thank you. Just Lord wanted to confirm all the assumptions that go into this very important number.
And just so everybody understands, we have to work off the official revenue forecast from tax and others. And so things like grocery tax that have kind of made it through the process are accounted for, but the gas tax is still part of the ongoing budget negotiation. So until that's resolved,
So once the budget is adopted, we may receive an updated projections of revenue from Department of Taxation.
And of course, grocery tax isn't fully done because we don't actually have a state budget, so we don't know what's happening with local.
No, we don't.
It's in K-12, but pretty much everybody's been saying the half cent for transportation cost. So.
Great question. Thank you.
Any other questions?
all right. Tiffany's we're gonna, just to help with the audio a little bit, we're gonna have Tiffany sit up here at the table where she's a little bit closer.
And so this next item on our agenda is the Transit Strategic Plan, proposed guideline changes. Tiffany Kulinski. Thanks, Tiffany.
Thank you so much, and good morning. So it's my pleasure this morning to first make sure we have our security alerts, and then to talk to you this morning about our Transit Strategic Plan guidelines. It has been since its inception in 2018 that we have, and I have the pleasure of also having the author of those guidelines across from me with Dan Sonnenklar. But since 2018, we have had a number of TSPs that have been developed, and so I'd like to take an approach first to provide a high-level overview of our Transit Strategic Plan process, and then to cover two major proposed changes that we are looking at for the guidelines. So as a reminder, this was introduced in General Assembly legislation in 2018, requiring transit agencies that are operating in urbanized areas to develop a Transit Strategic Plan, or TSP. This will be different than what we have required in the past for transit development plans. So this TSP was to serve as a strategic blueprint that would outline desired changes to improve provision of transit services throughout each agency's service area within existing funding structures. So the existing funding structures definitely emphasizes a fiscally constrained approach. We identified with the legislation 16 agencies that fit the criteria, which I'll touch on the next slide. And this still stands true, but we may see some variances when we get the new census data out later this year. Next slide, please. So with agency requirements, the legislation identified 2 criteria, one of which means that the transit agency must serve an urbanized area with 50,000 people or more, and they must operate a fleet of 20 buses or more. In the legislation as well, they identify for the update frequency that they must update at least once every 5 years. And then the annual update requirement is something that we internally have always asked for our transit agencies to provide as part of our grant application cycle. So this is consistent with both our transit development plans and our transit strategic plans. We request this usually by a deadline of January 15th, ahead of our deadline for our grant applications that are typically due around February 1st. Next slide, please. So moving into the first proposed change. So we are recommending modifying our annual update process. It is usually submitted as a letter submission. We provide a letter template for all of our agencies to populate information for. And instead, we found that it might be more of a useful tactic for us internally at DRPT as well as our transit agencies to approach it from a joint quarterly meeting. So some of the rationale behind that. First of all, when you are waiting for letters from 39 different agencies, the timing is not always consistent. And so that has a major impact in how we can then turn around and review our applications for eligibility and need. Our transit program managers are already doing quarterly meetings with all of our transit agencies, and we found that by having the transit planner be able to participate in one of those quarterly meetings and be able to go through the annual update letter, have that engagement process, that there would be a better understanding, and then we populate that information ahead of our grant application cycle. So that way, also, it is a training piece. So a lot of times with new years, there's new staff that are responsible for data, performance data, and reporting to us. So we also see this as an opportunity to be able to help our transit agencies with smaller staff to get more familiar with some of the elements that we're looking for in an annual update letter. And of course, like I mentioned, it ensures timely delivery of the annual update ahead of our cycle. Before I move on to the anything else about this, are there any questions about this first proposed change?
Chair, I think one of Kate's questions relates to that. I don't know if you want to call on her or try to interpret her.
I think that her first question was about the review cycle, and I think that's under the second change. Yeah.
I'll just ask a question that demonstrates once again that I don't run an agency, and that is when I first saw this proposal, it looked as if it was more work for the transit systems, but I didn't understand that there were these quarterly meetings already going on. So is there a general sense here that this is something that will be beneficial to the transit company?
I agree with you. As of right now, what I'm hearing, it sounds like more work for the transit system. So, yeah, help me understand.
Right. So what we're looking at, instead of sending you the letter and then having you populate it, we would have that similar form, and we're going to have it ahead of the quarterly meetings, and then we would generate that with you at the meeting. So instead of you having to put it together, we'd be able to be there to also, there's a lot of back and forth that happens with annual update letters on our end to get clarification on what was complete in terms of service changes or capital improvements, and then your anticipated improvements, and then how that all is related in terms of consistency with your transit development plan or your transit strategic plan. So by being able to address it within a 1.5 hour period, that we feel would be able to expedite that process instead of having the back and forth of phone calls or emails and then different versions of that update being out there.
Sounds like more work. Can I jump in? And this is the outside looking in. I know Tiffany and her team, there's a lot of back and forth on these letters every year. And it's amazing that letters, how frequently letters come in that don't have things in it that are then in the application that comes in 2 weeks later. And so that's what the back and forth is, that there's kind of this disconnect between the grants folks and the planning folks. And it's not just one or two transit agencies, it happens pretty much across the board. And so the thought was, instead of doing this paper thing and kind of throwing things back and forth across the fence,
that we would sit down at the table together and work through it together. And so that's what we're trying to accomplish with the change, is to have a dialogue about it instead of just throwing paper back and forth. But the intent is certainly not to put more burden on the transit agencies, but I do have to say it's a burden on us to have to track down people that can't make that connection in the transit agency.
Mr. Chair, I think this makes sense. I'm kind of curious, would this change the timeline at all in terms of when we would need to kind of have this data ready to discuss with you instead of put in a letter?
Yes, so we would have to be able to correspond that roughly before the grant cycle. So we were trying to figure out the timing, and that's where the program managers would come in to be able to figure out when they're planning quarterly meetings, so you're not having another meeting on top of meetings with us. So it would be a little bit earlier in the time frame. We were thinking probably around the September, October time frame to kind of have things together to generate. But that is to say that this proposed change is still something in flux. And so I was looking for some comments back today, especially from you all as transit agency's perspective, to see about timing, because I only see it from our side in terms of our processes. So if it seems that it's going to be a challenge to try to do that too far in advance of when you're going to start generating your grant applications, then we can kind of discuss how that may be better executed on our end.
If I may add one more thing, there was a lot of emphasis in the 2018 legislative package on the importance of planning as part of our capital budgeting effort, and that's why that transit strategic plan became a legislative requirement. And to Dr. Smoot's earlier point about ridership, as we are looking at ridership recovery and what does commuting and travel look like after the pandemic, good planning is what we need to have in place to be able to kind of work through that together. And what we see with the grant applications is a lot of times we see projects that are added, and it's not because of planning, it's just because, I want to put in a grant for that, and I'm just going to put it on my letter so I can check the box, because we will, if it's not in a plan, it's not eligible for funding, and we don't waver from that. So I don't want to miss out on that piece of it as well, that really this is part of a dialogue to strengthen that planning element and that collaboration between DRPT and the transit agency. Not trying to tell anybody what to do, but to have a dialogue and to really understand that the capital needs are coming out of the planning process that's based in this legislative requirement.
Jennifer, did you say there are 39 agencies?
It's 39, 40. We vary. I think I said 40 last night. She's probably correct, Dr. Smoot.
Okay, so that in round numbers is 160 meetings a year, right?
If you correct, yes. And that happens now.
How are you going to do that?
We already do that with our transit program managers here. They're out or they're virtually working with their transit agency partners 4 visits a year. So that's already something we do. This was just adding another component to that dialogue.
Okay.
Brian?
Yeah, so the question, I want to make sure I'm clear that these quarterly meetings are going to replace the update letter. So we're not going to get a message 1st of December that we have to then compile the letter. Mm-hmm. While I think there may be a slight amount of extra work that's added throughout the year, that potentially could be offset, having gone through several of these update letters, by the time that it takes to generate that letter, because it really is going back to the planning piece and keeping the planning process moving all along, where in smaller agencies, you typically see that some things like this tend to get put on the back burner until you get that notice that, this is due next month. It's also due while you're trying to prepare your grant application during that application process. So actually, I think once we get in the groove of this, it'll actually help the agency be more prepared to submit their application by February 1st, as opposed to trying to juggle and do both things at the same time.
Right. You are correct. It would replace the letter. So we would be generating that during the meeting, and then you would satisfy your requirement after that meeting. And we would make sure that everything that we recorded would be vetted by the transit agency and before we would move forward as part of incorporating that into the grant review process. I will also say that in the annual update that we saw that there are areas that were perhaps redundant in terms of other reporting that has been consistent over the last few years, especially related to operating. Our program managers now are more involved in reviewing operating applications, and so we may not need as much information as what we have requested in the past too. So we will make an effort to not make this more work, but we are trying to make this so that you don't have to keep going back to it over and over.
Mr. Chair, if I may, so I don't have really any issue with doing it because I think the engagement process is helpful. I do think it'll be more work, but whatever. I don't think that's a big deal. I think my bigger issue is I think it helps more with consistency between DRPT and the transit systems. I will say at some point I do wish we'd gotten to a place of whatever the issue is, we really work with those agencies and help identify who the problem children are. And it could be any of the systems I've worked for in the past.
Right.
But, that is probably, we're trying to fix the system when it's probably, the same. It might even be the same transit people that go to different agencies. But, that's just I think it'll help with the relationship with the program manager. And if it's more work or not, at the end of the day, who cares? Y'all give us money. Thank you. So, that would just be my comment, that it is going to be probably a little bit more work on both ends, but that's okay if it allows for some consistency and to get stuff done ultimately better. Yeah. So I would just say the comments that you may get of, we have to kind of have this dialogue and I just say we need to push that aside, and I think it'll help with consistency because I think that's probably the issue. We're all marching to our own beat, and you have to deal with us.
It is not for lack of trying.
Oh, I live in the real world with it.
And I will say, being here for almost 5 years, to see how we have only one approach for all of our agencies that have different staffing, different resources, how they do different data collection. You definitely have some more robust and then some that are lacking. And so this way I feel like it's a little easier to customize in some ways rather to understand and not have people do too much work in some ways. Trying to
tell us to not do so much work.
Yes.
Ask for all that.
Right. We do see some robust letters come through. Yeah.
Kate, did you have anything you'd like to add?
No.
Okay. And Dr. Smoot?
I'm fine, thank you.
Great, thank you. Okay.
Chair, sorry, I have one more question.
Sure.
If adopted, when would these changes go into effect?
We would be trying to do this, well, it depends on the timing. Understanding how soon it would be if we were taking this to CTB later this year, it probably wouldn't be until next grant cycle. So not 24, but I would think 25 at this point.
And just for Dr. Smoot, for your benefit and for everybody else's, the code requires that the guidelines for transit strategic plans be approved by the TSDAC. And so we're governed by what we have in place until we take something back to the board.
Okay. Any other questions?
If we can move on.
All right, excellent. So I almost forgot about this. So elements of what's included in our annual update. So as I mentioned before, we do have one quarterly meeting that we would plan for our transit planners to attend with program managers. And then these are all the main elements of the update letter. So we ask any changes or progress to date related to your transit strategic plan, reviewing performance data, making sure that you have reported that to DRPT, discussing your short-term needs, primarily what's going to be anticipated for the next grant cycle. Check, make sure that you've updated your vehicle inventory, reviewing ridership trends. We also mentioned about transit asset management in our public transportation agency safety plan reporting. That is an element that we have added to the update since last year. And then any other planning needs. So if there's changes in the governance or the board structure of your agency, fare changes, so if you decide to go fare-free as an example, any route studies or system redesigns that might have been conducted, and then new services, facilities. And then the last one is unforeseen fluctuations in events. So if there has been something that has happened that was unexpected and we need to account for, and there needs to be an explanation that can't be tied to your transit development plan, the transit strategic plan, this would be the opportunity to bring it up. So I will throw out the example. So GRTC didn't anticipate losing a bus in, a couple years ago, but things happen. And so that's the opportunity to be able to explain why you may need an additional bus ahead of the replacement cycle. And as we've been discussing, this would all be completed ahead of the next grant application period. Next slide. So then moving into the second proposed change. So this addresses the review cycle, and Kate, I will answer this question for you. So we are modifying this in the guidelines. We define it more as a major update to minor update. So some of the rationale, so we've completed roughly about 4 TSPs since we had the legislation go into effect. And we've seen that this can be a huge cost burden depending on the agency. We have had variances in what the costs would anticipate, the scope of work. And so understanding that the legislation, it can be interpreted that every 5 years, you may need to do a major update, which could be an overhaul of your system plan. But what we wanted to say is that sometimes that may not be necessary. Within a 5-year time frame, also considering your annual updates and then work with your DRPT staff, you may only have some minor changes, updates to demographic information, maybe changes to 1 or 2 routes that may not necessitate you doing a major overhaul. So this provides clarification to say that when we say every 5 years, we're not asking you to do a whole new plan, that this can be an update to your existing TSP once you've developed your first plan. Next slide. And so what that would look like in the guidelines, so we would change this, so a major revision would still stay, where an agency, if they did opt at the 5-year cycle to do a revision, we would ask that they make sure that they understand that they are going to be responsible for funding that revision. They could be eligible to apply for our technical assistance grant program to cover the part of the cost. That is a 50% state, 50% local match. And a lot of our transit agencies are actually doing that for developing their first TSP. And then elements of the interim update. So this would be addressing the key elements of a TSP that were outlined in the guidelines and the legislation. So updating system performance evaluation, demographics, or what we had termed evaluation of the transit market demand, and then any significant changes to the other sections. So what we cover typically in an annual update, that could be condensed and put into your interim update. And we found that having this option would also alleviate some of that concern about the timing. So, from a management perspective, we're trying to spread out the timing when agencies are due to update their TSPs so that we also can manage how much are being applied for to our technical assistance. Because year to year, if everyone is on the same cycle, there's going to be years that we're just not going to be able to help fund all of our agencies and be able to provide the technical assistance on our end for our agencies to be able to help them develop their plans. So Kate, that was kind of the rationale as to why we were going to change about the review cycle. Did you have any follow-up questions to that?
No, I appreciate it. As I said, in some of this, I'm fielding questions on behalf of my other transit systems. And so one of the questions that they had was when you talk about their routine sort of route optimization studies, sort of how do they fall? Is this considered a major revision, an interim update? How would that look?
So I think if you're thinking like route optimization, system redesign, I would have to say that's kind of based off scale. Some people may just be looking at changing headways or scheduling. Some people may actually be introducing expansion. So I would say if it's an expansion of your service to a certain degree, then I would almost look at that as a major revision. But I want to be clear that we want to make sure that when you do updates to TSP, it is not just focusing on a network redesign, but you are also updating kind of the vision and strategic plan of your agency, as well as any kind of information related to your fare structure, your governance, and other planning needs.
And if I could add, the intent of this change is to give the transit agencies more flexibility in terms of that 5-year mark than what is in the guidelines right now. And we're just finding that we don't need to require something as robust every 5 years. We need to require something every 5 years because that's what the code tells us to do. But it doesn't have to be all of these elements, depending on where you are. Mm-hmm. And when that legislation was drafted in 2018, it was, we'll use the Great Richmond example. I'll look at Sam. There were systems that hadn't looked at their route and route redesign or any, at any large measure in decades. And it was to try to shake some of that loose. We had seen the success in Richmond, and we built off of that for the guidelines. But the guidelines, as they are drafted right now, are very heavily focused on that route redesign and that's not something that needs to happen every 5 years. And so we're also saying that these are really costly endeavors. They're good, but we don't need to do it that way every 5 years. So it's intended to give another tool in the toolbox for transit agencies to be able to take a different path.
I just note that Mr. Dyke has joined the meeting now, and any questions anybody has or comments?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I really appreciate the flexibility of this. I like this proposal. I guess I had yet another timing question. When you say at the 5-year, you'll work with us and we'll figure out, does it need to be an interim update or a major update? What are you envisioning in terms of when that conversation will begin? Because if we do need a major update, we need some lead time to line up the funding for that, especially if we're going after a TA grant.
Correct.
How is that going to kind of work?
So what we're seeing with TSP is it can be anywhere from 12 to 18 months to develop a plan. So you really would have to have the conversation almost 2 years in advance, which seems very early, but we would engage you at that joint quarterly to understand when the timing is, and we'll do our best to also remind our agencies, if they don't already know, the timing when they would be due for TSPs. And then we would encourage you, when you apply for TA, if that's the desire you want to go for. And then TA funds are available July 1st. So you would be able to plan it starting of when, if you're awarded, when the funds would be available. But I would say 2 years ahead to be able to plan that accordingly, depending on the list. So if we're seeing that there aren't any significant changes, we can revisit it at that 2-year mark and then see if that's necessary or not. I anticipate that everyone's going to try to apply for TA anyways, so I would say that usually around that 2-year mark we would have that conversation.
Okay. Thank you. Anyone else?
And this will show I'm not a transit operator. So we have the 10-year planning horizon. Code says we have to do 5, but doesn't specify major, minor. So one question is, if we make this change, is administrative guideline change and not CTB?
That is CTB.
It's CTB.
Everything is,
Yes, CTB. All right.
because it's TSP and it was written into the code that that guideline has.
Like major and minor.
Correct.
Okay. And then more content-wise, on one slide we have major and interim, and then we're also using the word minor. Is interim and minor the same?
Yes, it should be the same. I'm sorry for that.
I just wanted to understood. I do think the timing's important, and we deal with this with comp plans and strategic plans of the totality. You get the funding and stuff 2 years ahead, may not know if that's major or minor. So I'm kind of curious how you all will deal with that, because that unexpected thing could create it to be a major.
Right.
2 years later.
I mean, that's kind of the nature of planning, right? You plan and you do your best to be able to project out, but sometimes you have to adapt to that. So if it necessitates, so you have to change a board, or there's requests that maybe you want to do, the transit agency has to do something more robust. We'll work with the transit agency to be able to identify ways to be able to modify scopes and so forth. All we are looking for is just to be able to have that flexibility for our agencies to decide what kind of scale of update they need for their TSP. So if it ends up being that they need to do some changes, they would just need to work with their appropriate program manager or planner to be able to communicate that, and we will do our best to support them.
Sounds like the earlier recommendation, quarterly touching base with engagement would be helpful.
Right.
And then is the decision that it's minor or major the transit operators?
Yes.
It's usually discussed, but it's not really joint or PRBT, it would be the transit.
Yes, as long as they're addressing the guideline, like the criteria that are part of the TSP elements, then we will let the transit agencies define that. We do have that flexibility in the legislation, as we've been saying, that they aren't super prescriptive in terms of what's the scale. So I think that's to an advantage of transit agencies.
Any other questions or comments?
Okay.
Okay, Dr. Smoot? We'll, move on.
I'm good, thanks.
Okay.
Great.
So the last slide was just demonstrating what that cycle is. That was what was being discussed about the 10-year planning horizon that's required for TSPs, and then how those update cycles would look. So yes, it would be an interim update. I apologize for not updating that in the slide. And I believe with that, concludes my presentation. Are there any other questions that I can address today? If not, I'll be glad to hand it over to Dan.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. And now we move on to War and Peace.
War and Peace, read today by Dan Santa Claus.
Something to talk about.
And maybe a few, so, first of all, I wanted to thank you all for the spirited discussion last time. All of your feedback was very helpful, and I hope we reflected what we heard from you all in these revisions to these slides. For the presentation today, in the 70 slides that we sent out, I included all of the proposed changes, but I'm going to try to concentrate just on those ones that are changing from last month. Now, they're all here, so we can reference any of them if you'd like, but we're going to kind of feel this out, and how it gets kind of complicated to refer to changes. And so, as we go through, please, I think we can just kind of stop at each one and discuss. I think that's probably the most efficient way to do this. There is a lot to get through today, but we do want to give all of these capital considerations, their time needed, and so I can cut back some of the operating presentation as well if needed. So let's go ahead and get started without further ado. Next slide. So the first recommendation, as you all remember, was to edit the definitions of the three categories that go into the capital program. Under this recommendation, we heard a lot of feedback from you all that I will try to summarize before getting into some of the changes here. We were asked to examine the $2 million threshold that we currently have between minor enhancements and major expansions, and to look at whether that's appropriate or not, or whether that should go up. We were asked to further clarify the major expansion definition. We were also asked to adjust the language a bit regarding projects that do not fit one of the categories to really only apply to exceptional circumstances. And we heard that it would be helpful to illustrate how specific facility renovation and retrofit projects would fit into these new categories generally. And so to that end, if you could flip the slide 5, I would just go over the changes. Okay, so the red text indicates a change from the previously adopted policy on this slide. The underlining and the green arrow then addresses a change that we made to last month's presentation. Okay, and that's going to be consistent throughout these slides. Please ask if you have any clarifying questions. So first of all, we took a look back at the recent capital applications, and we determined that the $2 million threshold should actually increase based on rising costs and inflation and some of the applications that we've received over the past few years. And so our first recommendation, which is reflected in all of these definitions, is to up that threshold to $3 million. So for state of good repair and minor enhancements, the definitions are roughly the same, incorporating that $3 million threshold. So I'll just read the state of good repair one real quickly. This is capital projects and programs to replace or rehabilitate existing assets, excluding major capital construction projects with a total cost over $3 million. Then for the minor enhancements, the capital projects and programs that add capacity include purchase of assets meeting the following criteria, and the only real change in there was the $3 million threshold. For the major expansions, we added some additional language that clarifies that the replacement of an entire existing facility would be considered now a major expansion, and so that's reflected in the definition here. So it refers to capital projects and programs to add, expand, or improve service, or the replacement of an entire existing facility. Again, the total cost exceeding $3 million is included in the criteria there. The next slide gets to the changes to the added language, and I'll just review this before pausing to discuss. So in terms of the additional language, we adjusted to be quite a bit more specific here. So now I will say something along the lines of that in rare circumstances, projects that are submitted to us for funding do not fit the definition of a major expansion project. I'm sorry. They fit the definition of a major expansion project based on the cost, but they do not actually expand the provision of transit services and do not have an impact on ridership. So in these cases, the DSCC director will reserve the right to determine the correct number. And so I'll pause there to take some questions and concerns.
All right. Anybody have any questions?
I do, but I don't have to be first.
First is great. It makes you a leader. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Okay, so just for clarification, does this added language only apply to major expansion? That was the example, but I just wanted to make sure that's the only category that this flexibility applies to.
So the intent of the expanded language was to address these kinds of expensive projects that don't really solidly fit into the major expansion category. And so, yes, in this case, this would only really refer to major expansion. So it gives us the ability to shift those into minor enhancements if they fit the character.
And that decision is only PRPT's director of the interpretation of it.
So, I mean, ultimately, we need to put the responsibility on somebody in the language. We could include something about, you know, a back and forth between the agency and the director, but I think this covers that, and it will. I mean, the way that these work out, there's often a bit of a back and forth on these kinds of applications.
This is really clarifying what we've already been doing.
Yep.
Exactly.
More to put it out on
There's-
the public.
There's plenty of gray area in these applications, and we've kind of been swimming around in that gray area for years now. This gives us the ability to like pin it down that we have had to make those determinations. We have shoved a few square pegs into some round holes to make it fit, but I think this makes for a better process and a more fair process, and still follows the letter and the spirit of the law.
And we can go to the next slide as well. This is the one that illustrates how different kinds of facility renovation or retrofit projects would fit these different categories generally. You know, it's case by case. In every circumstance, it's case by case, but generally this is what we do, is that the types of projects that would involve some sort of facility retrofit that would fit into SGR are those that are replacing a specific facility part with a quantifiable age and a DRPT accepted estimated service life. So some examples here: commercial roofing, cameras for buildings, asphalt for parking. Within the minor enhancement category, we're really looking at renovations within the existing footprint of the building. So the replacement of facility parts without a quantifiable age and BSL would also fit into this, because we simply cannot calculate the asset condition score for this. And then for major expansions, that would really refer to expansions to an existing facility, so those that really change the footprint of that facility. Now, again, these are general, and so if there's a really expensive project that's going to happen within the existing footprint of a facility and have an impact on operations that can be quantifiable, it may also fit into a major expansion category. It's going to be circumstantial.
One comment, you actually answered a question. Back on the major expansion, the added text of or the replacement of an entire facility. That's worded so that you're basically building a new facility, but then you move over to slide 7, it's talking about the expansion of an existing facility too. So there's some conflict.
So this is not going into policy. This is just an example from this group, and this is really referring to renovations and expansion projects, not a complete replacement of the facility. And so what we were trying to get at in the definitions 2 slides previous was if you were going to tear down an entire facility and rebuild a new one, it would also go into okay.
So could it be something, because you talk about the add, expand, or improve service.
Mm-hmm.
Could it also be worded to add or expand or improve the facility or the replace, like, so that, I'm thinking about the project that we have at Blacksburg Transit, because it is a true renovation, but it's also an expansion because we're building additions onto the building as well as a new maintenance service line. So I'm thinking about that project and trying to figure out if we were to apply for that today under these guidelines, where would that fall? Because I could argue it could fall under minor and, well, I could argue it could fall under standard repair or major, and the match rates or the funding rates are different because of 68% state for standard repair, but major is only 50% state. So I'm using my own example right now to sort of flesh out a problem that may rear its head in the future.
So that project would still be considered a major expansion project because of the cost and the fact that you're expanding the facility in addition to renovating it.
Okay.
Right, so I think that would be a pretty clear cut one if it came in for us. And so, I mean, so what we you know, it's not necessarily the replacement of the entire facility, but it's also the expansion of those facilities. So yeah, it says add, expand, or service. You could say service or facilities or the replacement of the entire facility. If that provides further clarification.
Yeah, I think it would be behoove us to sort of add a clarification of the addition on an existing facility that's fairly major.
Okay.
I think I took some time to read it, and I appreciate your example because you've got a lot of ores, and then you get width, and then you've got exceeding 2 million ores. You've got, you got to really read it and parse it right to make sure you're interpreting it. So take it to an example.
Yeah.
Just take it back to the language. So this only applies to major expansion for the ability to fix something that doesn't conform. Does that mean a project is not, let's say they applied for a major, and it doesn't fit, does it leave major and go to one of the categories, or it could still be a major, it just doesn't meet this definition?
Let me see if I understand the question. Can you rephrase? I'm sorry.
Yes, I'm trying to decide if we need to pick the project category for projects that do not conform. It could be a major project doesn't conform to major, but you leave it there, and it applies better there than minor or strategic, or does that language mean if they change its category to minor?
So it's really, yeah. What I attempted to do with the language was really to take expensive projects that don't fit major and allow us to either score them as SGR or minor enhancement. And usually it would be a minor enhancement if it's in this realm of kind of shifting back and forth. Every once in a while there might be something, we have this conflict between SGR and major expansion that we tried to clarify with including the facility language. And so really this is getting at the example that I used last time was this large technology project that HRT put through that was $3.7 million. That we ended up scoring as a major expansion, but didn't really fit into a major expansion category because it was a mobile ticketing technology. It didn't necessarily have a direct impact on making more attractive. Yeah.
So now would you say that improved service and it was over $3 million, so now it meets the major definition?
So I would say that it doesn't expand the provision of service or impact ridership directly, and so it would shift to minor.
But it wouldn't be interpreted to improve service.
What's that?
Well, so we have add, expand, or improve. So it's an improvement, and so therefore it stays in major. As a good example, I was just trying to parse it out because, to Brian's point, this changes their match requirements.
Yes. And so, so the major definition does include improved service, but the added language is not addressing those projects that improve service. So a project can still improve service, but have a cost that's, that puts them in the major category, but doesn't have the impact. It doesn't necessarily expand the service. And so we can kind of iron out this language a little bit more if it's still confusing to you. But I think that this is getting at this shift. It's putting in on paper what we're currently doing when we find projects that don't fit the definitions well. And so if there is that confusion in there, I can certainly try to iron that.
Yeah, I appreciate the intent, but this gets me back to the or. Those conjunctions make a big difference in this and or. So I would read add, expand, or improve.
Okay.
And then it's over $3 million, so it looks to be like it just hits the definition of major. That may not be what you're intending.
Right. So the current definitions of add, expand, or improve, or the replacement of an existing facility. And so then the additional language says that, there's certain projects that fit the funding threshold, but that do not actually expand or increased ridership, so it's essentially difficult to score. And so that's why they would shift back down into a different category. And so this is in addition to the definition. This is going to sit there that allows that flexibility. And so, like I said, I mean, we can work with the language in the added language or in the major expansion, but I guess I'm unclear exactly where that clarification would come through.
Yeah, I guess right now I'm looking at the definition of major expansion, but can I turn to our transit operators who would have to be interpreting this when you apply for an application?
I'm sitting here going through my mind. It's more of the scale. The example of the HRT project, that technology project, is because of how large HRT is and how many buses there are, it's going to cost more. But if I were to do it in Blacksburg, it would fall under, well, hopefully well under that $3 million mark. So I don't know. If there's a way to put some sort of scaling that project with a system of smaller size and scaling it to that system, would that system still would it still fall under major if it was scaled for a smaller system? I think is maybe one way to look at this, because with your example of the facility renovation expansion, ours is obviously a major enhance or a major expansion project. So somewhere like, let's say, Farmville, very small, they obviously need a much smaller building, but would it still be considered a major? Right. So I think if we could figure out how to quantify the economy of scale,
yeah, it's very
which is going to be tough.
Right, and so part of it is setting a threshold limit for funding, but another part of it is that the scoring system for the major expansion project is based on increased service, increased ridership. And so if we can't calculate that as part of it, it doesn't, I mean, we come up with a way of estimating what the ridership impact could be, but it's kind of just making a square peg into a round hole in that case.
Yeah, I think my question is less about the added language as the major expansion definition, because following William's line of thought, I think, correct. That would be an expansion and improvement whether you're in Farmville or Blacksburg.
Mm-hmm.
So it's going to add, expand, or improve service, or let's say it's not a replacement of the entire facility. And it's less than $3 million, but it expands. That's just, is it falling in?
Right. So if it was less than $3 million, it would go into the minor category.
So there you
It's
get
a $5 million.
scale already.
Yeah. If it's a $5 million project compared to a $10 million project, it would likely be considered a major expansion project if it is allowing them to expand service and expand their maintenance capacity and their operational capacity. And so that's the kind of thing that we're looking for in these applications.
Well, theoretically, aren't we talking about maybe having some discretion at the director's level to look at this project and say, well, if this is Farmville, so we're going to do it one way, and this is a larger jurisdiction, do it another way? In other words, as far as how you're making that decision, that not all jurisdictions are similar, and that what is minor in one place might be major in somewhere else, and somebody's got to have the flexibility to make that decision.
Yeah, certainly, and that's certainly part of what goes into it, but really it's the character of the project and the cost of the project that would dictate that, not necessarily the location of it. Now, the example of a technology project, which would cost $4 million in HRT's territory, but maybe $800,000 in another area that's much smaller, then I mean that's where like the scale is very different. But if it's a project that is multi-million dollars and is allowing its service to expand its provision of transit services in its service area, then it would be considered a major expansion for either of these.
Well, I guess the point I'm getting at is here it's going to be awfully hard to craft definitions, examples to cover every possible situation. So you got to have some discretion in there to make that determination. Is this Farmville, or is it Manassas, or is it Fairfax, or whatever?
Yeah, I do concur, and I think the discretion is very helpful, especially codifying what's happening already. I just wanted to make sure that the definition was the added language and the words and flow, and it doesn't unintentionally create a,
Right.
I can't interpret it, which one does it fit in?
Well, that's the point I'm getting. I mean, having been in a position where you have to make calls at state level, you need to have some discretion because not every jurisdiction is the same.
Right.
And if there's no way you're going to craft a definition, it's going to cover everything. Just saying.
Yeah, and that's where the ors and ands come in.
Yeah.
You know, we can certainly take a crack at maybe simplifying some of the ors and ands language to include what we're trying to get at here, but be more clear about it. But I certainly understand the point. This language with something like this is quite difficult to practice perfectly. Yeah.
I think the concept I'm comfortable with, I just want to think the unintended consequences.
So I have one, thinking along the lines of the ands and ors, would removing the improve from that statement and just leave it as refers to capital projects or programs to add or expand service or the replacement of the entire facility, would that accomplish what we're trying, because the improve piece, like, what is the definition of improve? Like, adding technology is an improvement, adding a bus shelter is an improvement. I would consider increasing frequency as an expansion of service, even though you're not changing your footprint. That's more of an expansion of service as opposed to an improvement. I just throw that out there because I think that might help, because the improved piece seems to be what I'm hearing we're sort of swirling around.
That helps tie to the added language for the discretion, because that's only dealing with expansion
Yes.
of services or ridership. That's not an improvement. That's significant.
So it would read, refers to capital projects or programs to add or expand services or facilities or the replacement of an existing entire facility. So there are a lot of words in there still, but if you separate them with commas, you kind of make it work. But yeah,
Discretion. I mean, one person's approved, but expansion is somebody else's approved. I mean, I don't see how you can tell the difference between an expansion. If you're expanding it, in my view, you're improving it.
right.
And adding to the expansion. If you pick one word, you eliminate one or.
Okay. Do people agree that we want to maybe drop the word improve in here?
Is there a difference between add and expand when you look at an application? Something is applying, or are you guys exploring?
So I think a lot of this language came from the original documentation, which may have been inspired by smart scale language around these kinds of projects. Unfortunately, I wasn't involved in a lot of the original drafting of this, and so I don't remember exactly. But that is likely where the add expanded came from. I'm sorry.
I'm gonna make my language fit whatever the application says, so I don't.
Okay.
I'll defer to the group, but literally, we go through and say, what does it say? And then if we have some back and forth with DRCT, it's gonna be whatever language that I want to be successful in. Y'all gonna, accept that.
So how about this? How about I'll take a crack at revising this, and we'll send this out as a follow-up to the discussion together with any other follow-up. All right, moving on to number 2. So within the second recommendation, which was to add a provision to the CCD policy, allowing for a lower local match rate for projects receiving federal discretionary funds, we heard a couple of things. So we heard that it would be helpful to clarify that this would only apply to capital projects. And we heard that it would be helpful to provide some information on how additional discretionary funds coming into the state would impact the capital program statewide. And so really the only change here is to add the word capital, which is highlighted, which I think accomplishes that first, or addresses that first issue. And then for the second one, In these next two slides, I tried to illustrate how an increase in discretionary funding for real projects that we approve would impact not only those projects, but our program across the whole state. And so the first table here shows 3 real projects that were approved in FY22 with total cost federal, state, and local for bus replacement projects in the GLPC, Richmond, GRPC, and HRP. And so the major takeaway here is that without the discretionary funds coming in, those 3 projects alone cost the state $22.5 million based on a 68% match rate across all 3. And the local cost is highlighted here too at 4%. It's $1.3 million across all 3 projects. The second table below illustrates those same 3 projects with a 75% federal match through a discretionary program, the bus and bus system. And so what that does clearly, in the circled area, is it drops the state match to $7.6 million across all 3, and it would drop the local to half of what it was before, based on that new provision of providing or allowing agencies to have a 2% local match or a lower local match. So if you look at the next slide, please, the benefits on the whole program are kind of outlined. So based on 3 discretionary grants coming through for those amounts listed, the benefits of we would have had a $14.9 million savings to the state, which would have allowed us to fund 47 additional minor enhancement projects. And in that year, 2 major expansions, because those 2 major expansions were quite low cost to the state. They were big projects that were asking for a small amount of state money. It also would have given us a $2.3 million savings to the state-controlled 5339 account that we control because of the impact on the GLPC buses. We often try to support our small urban areas with those 5339 accounts. And that would have allowed us to fund all of the small urban projects that were requesting those funds in that given year at the full amount that they were requesting. And of course, it would lead to a 50% reduction in the local commitment on those specific projects. So this is just trying to get at what an influx of federal money on big projects could have on our state budget. So I'll stop there and take any questions. So these slides illustrating won't get into the policy, of course. The only policy change is to add the word capital back to slide number 8.
Any comments or questions?
Is there a minimum required match at the local level?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the beginning.
Is there a minimum required match at the local level?
Currently,
Yes.
the minimum required match is 4%. And so what this would do is it would give us flexibility to allow a lower match should an agency receive discretionary funding for a project. But on all other capital projects supported through our program that do not have that discretionary money, the 4% still remains. Does that clarify?
Thank you.
So this is Kate. I have a question, and you may be getting it to a bit later, so tell me if that's the case. Part of it's the mechanics. There's a little bit of chicken and egg. So obviously we have a whole bunch of systems applying for discretionary money right now, right? And we don't know when we're going to come. There's also the earmark world that's starting as well. You know, sort of mechanically, how does that work? And if you end up covering that a little bit later, that's fine. But sort of how should our jurisdictions look to DRPT on that local match when they're applying? I mean, does that make sense, the mechanics of it?
Yeah, and I think you're getting at, chicken before the egg, cart before the horse. We've discussed this a lot recently, that a lot of the discretionary funds become available during our kind of current cycles that are underway. And so
the federal cycle is so different than the state. Yeah.
And so to that point, I think so. This first year of this enhanced discretionary programs for bus and bus facilities and low-no are happening right now while the SIP is still being considered, still in draft form. And so what we would hope is that in future years, agencies would go after discretionary funds prior to applying for and receiving state funds, which would then allow us to kind of tweak the dynamics and lower their local match based on what they've received through the discretionary application. Now this year, because
that's optimistic, but as you know, the feds do things in their own schedule, and a lot of it has to do with the availability of a continuing resolution, which is never done in the fall. So just to be mindful of, you know, the schedule that the feds have may not be helpful for you guys, or for us, for that matter.
So is the issue with these. Now, I think for the low-no and bus facilities grants, they've published, SDA has published a schedule of, I believe, a draft schedule of when those are supposed to come out. And from what I saw, at least next year, they're projected to come out at the same time. Now, I haven't seen any updates to that, but I'm curious if any of you have seen any of that information come out.
Well, it's always very optimistic, but just knowing that the discretionary space, yes, we have a FAST Act, and that's a really, really good thing, but weird things happen at the federal space, even things being held up by White House because they love the program. So it's just something to be mindful of, is that it may not be as perfect as a schedule that was published last month may say.
Understood.
And hopefully maybe that's where the next recommendation can go in between.
Exactly, yeah, the next, so recommendation number 3 was getting at some of those administrative challenges that we have. And so I can move on to that one. We can review that again in this context, and that would be helpful. But yeah, those points are certainly well received. And it's going to be a bit of a learning process for how we mesh these programs together.
And don't get me wrong, I am delighted that you guys want to be helping make it possible and leveraging money for these. It's just sometimes the mechanics are going to be awkward, and we're all just going to have to figure our way through it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great.
Might be good. Well, I appreciate the opportunity to lower.
Great. All right, so let's move on to number 3, if that's okay. So, recommendation number 3 was creating a capital set aside each year that DRPT can use to support discretionary project applications as they come up throughout the year. And so this gets at those cycles being slightly off. And if we have a sufficient amount of funds set aside, we can then distribute those as the programs become available and as they're awarded. And so what we heard last time on this one was there wasn't a ton of discussion here, but that it would be helpful to clarify why we're pursuing this change in the language, and which really gets at our intent to address these off-cycle discretionary opportunities that arise. And so I added a little bit of language here that just tries to clarify why we're doing this, which is to overcome administrative challenges and better support agencies seeking discretionary funding opportunities. That's the reason why we're creating this capital set aside. But that's really the only change here, to try to kind of define the spirit of the recommendation. And hopefully that gets to some of the concerns with these off-cycle opportunities.
The only recommendation I have here would just be to move it to the end instead of the beginning. I think just focusing on what you're doing, and then the reason why is kind of secondary.
The plan for that discretionary account on an annual basis, are you going to simply replenish it? Will it grow over time? What's the...
So that, we haven't discussed the dynamic, exactly how much we're doing there, how we'd be looking at that, but I think we'd monitor it, see how much we distribute from it, and kind of set a policy based on that. I don't know, Jen, if you have any other
Yeah, I think it's going to depend on what our funding level looks like and the applications and needs. But right now, when an agency goes to apply for federal discretionary money, we write them a letter. But that letter can't say, and we agree to provide X amount as capital match. And so not knowing, to Kate's earlier point, what the federal space is going to look like and how much that's going to weigh into the decision making, we've done okay with that so far, but we'd like to be able to do something a little bit more definitive. And by essentially establishing a reserve in our program, we still have to communicate any of those transfers to the Commonwealth Transportation Board for approval, but it would give us the ability with funding that we would have available to make those decisions in a mid-cycle space and not have to wait for a full another year to go through the 6-year program or to go back to the CTB with something in a rushed state when funds are awarded by the feds. And so we could have them there. We don't have to program them, so they're still there until we need them, but we have them when we need them to help those projects move forward.
Sure, I think that was where I was heading, is sort of what's the mechanics, what's the percentage, what's the cap, how long does it sit there, and I don't know if the scenarios can happen in first 2 years of probably a pilot.
And
I think that.
And I would, we always have, I shouldn't say always, the last couple of years have not been always, but, you know, we have a capital and operating reserve that we hold to help kind of smooth out economic challenges. We've had to dip in and out of that. And so we don't use that for projects. That's really there to help for operating if there's something drastic that happens with taxes or something like that. What this would do is set up a placeholder. And I'll give you an example, Vice Chair Master. When we went through the blue and yellow line shutdown with WMATA a few years ago, and everybody was worried about, you know, catastrophe of not having those services, we put in a line in the 6-year program and set aside $4 million to work with the jurisdictions, work with Kate and her team on a series of supplemental mitigation measures that we could then complement what Metro was already doing. So it's another layer of defense to, you know, help get people moved around with those services down for that very important state of good repair work. I envision this would be the same kind of situation. We're in communication with the transit agencies, Dan, Grant, Tiffany, they've all been talking to the transit agencies about what grant applications they're putting in. So we've got kind of a feel. I envision mechanically it would work that way. And so what we ended up doing with that line item is we ended up pulling money out of that. It was approved by the board for that purpose. They knew what we were doing with it. We do the same thing for this and then pull money out of that line item in the program as grant awards are made by FTA. And so we could set the amount based on, one, how much, if we have anything available and how much, and two, based on what we anticipate the ask to be around the state. I can tell you this is a priority for the Secretary, for us to do whatever we need to do to help line up to get more than our fair share and bring it back to Virginia. And so between the, you know, offsetting some of the local match and being able to go in a little stronger with a commitment to support these applications if they're funded, I think helps us do that.
I'll just add, I had a conversation with Dan yesterday about this same topic, and we're looking at applying under the LONA, and not having a standard commitment of like, we'll commit this percentage for the project leaves us a little leery to not apply for the full amount of federal, because the LONA, you can apply up to 85% federal, but if you come in with a lower federal share at 75 or 70, it automatically makes that project more appealing. But we're taking that potential 15%, 10 to 15% burden on not knowing. So just from an operator's perspective, it would be more comforting and more appealing for that agency to have that committed federal support.
I believe Dr. Smoot might have a question as well.
Dr. Smoot?
Okay.
Okay. Anybody else have any questions or comments?
Dr. Smoot, I think you're muted.
Am I,
There you
I hear
go.
you now.
Thank you. My question is, I like what we're doing here, but by taking these funds and setting them aside, what are we taking them away from?
They are dedicated to transit capital, so it would depend on what our capital needs are and where we, you know, sort of like we talked about with the board a couple of months ago with in the subcommittee. It's where you draw that line in terms of what you're going to fund on the priority list. And capital tends to be, we always use the term lumpy. I mean, the program's never the same thing twice. And so some years you have too much capital funding and some years you don't have enough. And so we're always moving money across years. And so Dr. Smoot, I don't think we're in a position where we would be taking something away, because bringing these federal dollars into what is largely a state capital program is actually going to give us more state transit capital to work with overall.
And we do not have an issue, I assume, in carrying over balances in these accounts from biennium to biennium.
No, sir, we do not. They are dedicated by code.
Great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. Ready?
Sorry. So sort of from the mechanics or the timing questions that Sam brings up all the time, I mean, is this going to be in this SIP where we're going to try to have a line item so we can start trying to capitalize on federally available funds, or when do you think we're going to get this policy updated and then be able to?
That's a good point. I don't think we can put it in the SIP until the CTB approves the policy that allows us to do that. And so it would likely be for the FY24 course.
I think that's important to know for somebody who might be applying now, that we will have to have some creativity to match it.
Yeah, this year we'll have to approach it a little bit differently. I think if agencies are awarded the federal funds, we can look at off-cycle changes, cycle grant, like that. But it'll be a little bit more difficult this year without that fund.
But I think it would be helpful after maybe a year to try to say what the percentage might be, or give some more definitive language that could be used to apply.
Okay.
All right. So between these two, that should hopefully provide some incentive and a little bit more, I guess, makes the process a bit easier. All right, moving on to number 4. So for number 4, there were no real recommended changes that came out of the discussion last time. However, I did have a correction to one of the slides in here that I wanted to reference. But before I do that, I just wanted to review what this one was. This is to update the asset condition score. This is for the good repair side to lower the floor burning point to 80% of ESL for all vehicle types, and it actually should say all asset types. And so this would be getting at kind of on-time delivery of vehicles and other assets that are requested through our program. You can go 2 slides. So whereas today assets in our system or in these applications start earning points at 95% of their ESL, this is just illustrating that they'll start earning points at 80. It doesn't mean that we're going to fund everything at 80, because that's going to depend on the amount of funding we have each year, but at least start stratifying them at a lower level to allow us to go deeper into the program. So the edit here was on the following slide. And there's a note at the bottom that should clarify this if you all reviewed this beforehand. But last time a question came up about the proposed policy and the possibility of receiving a vehicle before the one that is being replaced is in its useful life in that 12-year kind of 7-mile category. One thing I think we noted in this meeting is that we didn't account for the 5-month period between when the applications come in and when funding is available. And so when taking into account that 0.5 half of the year, it does push those delivery dates out further. That allows us to avoid that problem. Now, if a vehicle is delivered before 2 years, then that issue may still exist, and so the agencies will need to time their vehicle purchases and orders to match whatever their their FTA useful life on their vehicles is. The other thing we did here is we added the, just a little bit on vehicle type to the labels on the left side. There's multiple models of vehicles that fall into each of these categories, of course, but this is just to try to clarify what is what we're making. Any questions on this? Or on, I guess on this recommendation?
So I don't know, again, out of my wheelhouse, but I don't know whether there would be a circumstance similar to this. We just purchased a piece of fire equipment, a fire truck, and we're able to save about 10% of the cost because we were notified that if we were willing to make the contract at a certain point, that we would be able to avoid a planned price increase. Is that something that agencies encounter in terms of the purchase of equipment that might we kind of pass up opportunities?
So I think I will default to our agency representatives here on those. I mean, they're the ones that are interacting directly with the vendors.
Yeah, especially when it comes to usually like a state contract or a multi-year contract, you have those renewal options, and there's generally a price increase.
Mm-hmm.
The last vehicle that I was involved with ordering, we did make sure that we hit that mark as far as getting PO issued to avoid that 4 to 6% price increase. But it's more along the lines of whatever procurement contract there's available.
Right. Yeah, because it was through like Houston fire system. So I guess that's not something that's.
So yeah, I mean that would lead to different to timing I guess considerations for the individual agencies. But since we're evaluating the funding allocation that goes to those agencies, we leave the timing of the order up to the agencies that would be responding to that. So that wouldn't be reflected in this policy change. But they would, if it would be advantageous to order a vehicle earlier, if they do not qualify for funding in our system, they do not have in our scoring system rather, and we do not have those funds lined up, they simply won't be able to take advantage of any of the discounts applied early on. They would have to wait until.
Right. That's basically the question.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Well, although hopefully doing a little better at this time and dropping the, give a little more time flexibility as well.
Sure.
Yes, just as a comment, as long as your governing body, whether it's your city or your governing board, gives you basically the ability to order, even if you don't have the money in this 5 seconds, you're okay. Because what you do as a transit system, or what you should do, is basically slow walk your order. I'd order it in December, knowing that I may not meet all of these requirements. And then if I'm working with a manufacturer, I would say, can you bump me behind Chicago? And then you'll be in line with this. So some of it is just playing that game.
Yeah.
Very strategic.
Yeah, I gotta get that money.
Yeah.
That's right. All right. Should we move on to the next one?
Sure.
All right. If you all recall, recommendation number 5 here led to probably the lengthiest discussion last time, because this is the single most complicated recommendation, because it's not just one recommendation, it's multiple ones together. So in our discussion last month, we focused a lot on the impact these changes may have, and discussed better ways to illustrate those changes, but there weren't a ton of recommendations for changes within here. There were some specific ones, and I'll try to go over these here. So one of the major takeaways that we heard it would be helpful to have a better graphical representation of the changes within this recommendation. And to that end, I don't know if all of you picked this up, there is a large 11 by 17 printout that shows side-by-side tables for existing policy versus proposed policy. We also distributed this last week, and I realized that it may have been a little small if you tried to print it at home or in your offices.
It's smaller than monitors.
Yeah, exactly. So it still may be a little bit small, but we can also bring it up on the screen and kind of zoom in on certain aspects of it. The this hopefully helps keep track of some of the multiple moving pieces. We're proposing, especially on the service impact side of things, we're proposing changes to the baseline scores in addition to adding new categories and adjusting some of the score in the categories. And so hopefully the side-by-side helps with that a little bit. Again, we understand that it's probably not ideal, but it kind of spells that out. We also heard a few specific issues regarding the specific categories. One was the naming of the financial tools category, which wasn't quite appropriate, so I'll get to that. We can change that within here. Another comment we heard is it seemed that we were kind of double incentivizing projects that were including upgrades to bus stops and stations, and so we addressed that a bit more. And so I guess moving on to slide number 22. A couple of things here before we go to the video. Yes, I'm sorry, that's the correct one. So this is the proposed service impact score schedule organized by score. So it's in order of the default on the screen. I want to note here, sorry, and I should have said this early on, is that some of the slides in this presentation and the document that I passed out today they're slightly different than what we passed out last week, just because I made some corrections and some tweaks to the information provided. And so I will try to remember where I made those changes and point them out from this point on. And I'm sorry I didn't mention that earlier. But so in the visual display that you're all looking at in front of you, I corrected the order. There was one item that was out of order here, but it is in order on this screen here. And so what we also tried to do here was trying to highlight those new categories and changes made to those. And so I guess one thing I want to point out here is the customer facilities, bus stop, and shelter improvements. So that's a little further than halfway down this chart. We kept the high impact shift in the safety and security category, but based on some feedback we heard here, we in the frequency, travel time, and reliability, we rolled that back to no impact, because there was a valid point that it was just kind of double incentivizing these kinds of projects. So by increasing it, it does bump them up on the list a little bit, but it doesn't bump them up as high as they would have gotten before. Also, the incentive scores kind of address that group as well, and we can go over to that list momentarily. But yeah, the major change here was that, and then so it falls a little bit lower. It was above admin, maintenance, facilities that support operations before, and now that's a little bit lower down. It's too strong lower. And then one other small change on slide 24. So taking into account these proposed changes to the TSP guidelines, we are no longer asking for CDP and CDP update letters. And so one of the agency accountability items has changed to, instead of looking at on-time delivery of those or on-time submission of those letters, instead of looking at whether or not the TSP and CDP documents are up to date. And so those are the changes we've made from the last time, but I'm happy to speak to the whole approach here again. I don't know exactly how you all want to go through this specific series of recommendations. Would it be helpful for me to walk through?
I think just doing that at a kind of for the overview would be helpful.
Okay. So could you pull up the PDF document? Okay. And can you all see this on the screen, or is it too small? A little small. So it's on you. So yeah, that should be it. So I guess this series of images kind of summarize the overall change to scoring in the system. So currently, figure 1 on the left side shows that for SGR scoring, we currently derive points, 60 points from the active condition score, which is that age of mileage compared to ESL score, and service impact scores, which is more of a qualitative score based on 4 categories. Today, safe good repair projects receive up to 100 points when they're stratified in score. In the proposed new scoring, asset condition score and service impact still count for 40, but we're also proposing adding a new category called incentive scoring that replaces some of the additional considerations that went into the service impact score before, that allow for an extra 10 points, which increases the total to 110. And so those incentive points, those are 5 points available in each of 4 categories that address the current DRPT policy goals. That's zero emissions technology, innovation, safety and comfort around customer facilities, and the accountability category. In the minor enhancement category, similarly, in the past, service impact scores accounted for up to 40 points for each project based on those 4 categories of qualitative scores. There's also some additional considerations that you could get a few additional points here and there. And the new proposed scoring here would still have service impact score going up to 40, but remove the additional considerations and put them into the incentive score for a total of 50. So that's the high-level, big-picture change here. Within each of those changes, there are multiple things that are shifting around. So I guess if you want to go down here and try to go in the right direction there. So you can skip number 2. This is getting back to the previous conversation. So yeah, the left side is showing the current primary and secondary project types with their factor rating and default scores. To the right is the preferred. And that's where, if you're trying to concentrate on what we're doing to change here, this is where I would spend most of my time. Again, capital finance strategies, what we're calling these financial tools, which refers to capital cost and contracting and pre-approved or debt service that has been approved in the previous years. The capital finance strategy is a little bit more accurate based on some of the feedback we got here. Again, the customer facilities, but shelter improvements has moved up slightly in compared to the currently approved. So I guess I'll pause here and see if you all have any questions on any of that.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
I had a question on the incentive scoring. Under innovation, the installation of safety technology. Can you remind me what is meant by that?
All right. On the right, yes, right here. Safety technology. So this is really, this would be on vehicle safety technology. So it could be driver assistance tech. It could be anything that would help with customer safety and security. Could be even enhanced camera systems, facilities for buses, and so anything that addresses, technology safety tools. Which has become a ERP into a lot of our school.
I would just, I guess my comment would be, in the definitions when you get to actually implementing this and it being in an application, make sure it's very clear what you mean, because I could theoretically say, a new mechanism to open and close a gate at facility is safety technology. Just make sure that we can't interpret it too broadly.
Good suggestion, thank you. We will do that. What we did, if you look back at what we had last time, I think we had some specific definitions in the.
Yeah, I just didn't remember.
Well, I'm sorry, no, we had specific, in what we had last time. In the approved documentation, we do provide those.
Okay.
Those, we just haven't done it for these new categories, and we do. Thank you.
Any other questions?
And I guess one note on these incentive points. And so there's up to 5 points available in the first 3 categories if the project hits any of the characteristics listed. In the last category for agency accountability, agencies need to comply with all 4 of those to receive the 5 points. and we cap incentive points at 10 points. So if it was a project that, was zero emissions and innovation, and the agency was receiving the 5 accountability points, it would be capped at 10 instead of 6.
Sort of on a format question, 1, thank you for the side-by-side. 2, for the point on the incentive scoring, going back to my ands or, sorry about that. The first 3 categories have or. On the last one, it says all are met, but it shows and then content-wise, I really do like the new incentive scoring focus because it does really look like the set was sort of repeating and in general, the service impact schedule makes sense. So I'm going to put the grant together operationally reaction to that. But I do also like that there's a better spread between 10 to 0 versus 8 5. General comment.
Anyone else?
All right. Move on.
Mr. Chair, this is Kate. This is Kate Mattice. This is just a little bit of an administrative comment. When folks are shuffling papers, we hear that almost as loud as the voices. And I know it's hard to pick which one, but I just want to let you know it's really hard to hear voices. So folks have the ability to kind of keep the paper near the microphones low. It might make it easier for the rest of us to hear. Thank you.
I'm sorry, Kate. It was probably me. I'll stop.
Thank you for letting us know.
And we're probably not going to be shuffling papers quite as much.
After this, this is, the big handout was really for the last 2.
Thank you for the feedback, Kate.
All right, moving on to number 6. So this is where we were discussing updating the descriptions of some of the major accessibility measures to address some methodological considerations. And the majority of our conversation here last time was concentrated on opening up definitions of populations that could be considered disadvantaged. And what we really heard was that may take away from addressing the needs of the specific communities that are currently listed. And so what we are proposing here is for the workforce development and non-work destinations, we're going to continue with this recommendation to remove that. But for the disadvantaged population, the recommendation here is to put those 3 groups specifically back in. So we do concentrate on those groups that are spelled out by various different executive orders and pieces of legislation that have been passed by the federal government. So that's really the only change there. Okay, yes, disadvantaged population, so we look at it, we're going to include low income, minority, and limited English proficiency.
Okay.
All right, and actually that is the end of the changes to the recommended changes.
And now we get to the real content, the new stuff first.
They need a break.
I will.
Time.
But you can keep pushing. All right, so do we want to pause until restart at 11 and everybody can take a little break? That's
Sure.
7 minutes?
Okay. So we'll adjourn for the next 7 minutes. Slide. Yeah, I'll turn it back to you again.
All right, are we off mute? Okay. So, actually a couple more. Okay, so now we're going to switch gears here and get into our operating assistance program and explore some of the issues surrounding the current operating formula in this current point. So for this is a bit of a different kind of presentation. We don't have a series of recommendations to bring forward yet. Rather, we're going to work together to come up with consensus on how to address issues or concerns with the current operating formula. So for today's presentation, I'm going to outline the history of the operating assistance formula, where it came from, how TSDAC was involved. I'm going to review the current formula, the metrics and the weightings that go into it, and how it works. That part gets quite technical, so be prepared. And then I'm going to speak about how the formula has been applied since it was adopted, and highlight how the pandemic has really impacted some of our key metrics that go into it. And then finally, we'll review a projected FY24 scenario that shows what next year's allocation would look like if no changes to the formula are made. And so that took a bunch of assumptions to get to, but we'll review that when we get to it. Sound good?
Sounds great.
All right. So next slide. Prior to 2018, Virginia's transit agencies were allocated two forms of operating assistance. The first was called traditional, and it was based on the operating expenses, and the second was performance-based, based on the agency's performance compared to others using rolling 3-year averages. And so under the traditional operating funding allocation, an agency's reimbursement was proportional to their reimbursable expenses relative to all of Virginia agencies. And so if an agency's reimbursable operating expenses accounted for 5% of the total for all agencies, they would receive 5% of the traditionally allocated funds. Within the performance-based metric, we use something similar to what we use today, looking at some size-based metrics and some performance adjustments. And so the sizing metrics prior to the new formula going online took into account ridership and operating expenses, and the performance adjustments took into account revenue hours, miles, and net cost per passenger. So under the 2018 Transit Reforms Legislation, HB 1513, this eliminated the traditional approach to operating fund allocation, and so what the legislation stated was that funds should be distributed on the basis of service delivery factors based on effectiveness and efficiency measures established by the board. It also stated that we needed to review those metrics every 3 years. And so here we are, we're 4 years out, but we have the pandemic to deal with in the middle of this. So, yeah.
COVID time warping.
What's that?
COVID time warping.
So in 2018 and 19, TSDAC and ERPP worked together to develop policies and process towards moving towards a performance-based allocation that moved away from that traditional method. This committee unanimously approved the existing policy in December of 2018, and it went into effect for the FY20 cycle in early 2019. At the time when the committee approved the operating assistance policy, the only disagreement that was remaining was regarding the number of transition years that we built into the operating policy in that first year, and we'll get to that in a little bit when we review how we've applied this formula over the years. So back in 2018, in setting the policy, TSDAC set 6 goals in the process, which I'll just read quickly here. The first was to promote fiscal responsibilities. Second was to support robust transit services. 3 was to improve transit patronage. 4, to incentivize efficient operations. 5, promote mobility. And 6, to support essential safety nets. So all decisions that were made were evaluated against how they would help the state achieve these goals through the operating program. And so in our conversation this year, we expect to continue to keep these goals in mind throughout our discussions and changes that we are going to possibly be recommending. So before getting into how the current formula works, I thought it would be important to go over some definitions of some of the concepts that are involved. So the first 2 are on this slide. Operating costs for system sizing and operating costs for performance metrics. These are based on the most recently audited operating expenses available. For the system sizing measure, it's the most recently audited expenses, less depreciation, less expenses for projects funded through other DRPT programs, and less non-transit related expenses. For the performance metrics, it is also the most recently audited expenses, but less depreciation, ineligible costs, and non-related expenses. So in practice, what ends up happening with these two metrics is that the operating cost for system sizing is often slightly less than the operating cost for performance metrics. And that's to account for the other funding coming in through the RCP program. There's a note here on new service. And in the case that a new service comes online and applies directly to our operating program for assistance, we would rely on budgeted numbers, but normally we would fund new service through a demonstration grant for the first few years. And so through those demonstration grants, we would get a better idea of what the actual budgets are. So some other definitions here as well of metrics that are taken into account. We look at ridership, which is defined as unlaced passenger trips. We look at vehicle revenue hours, which is hours traveled by revenue vehicles while in revenue service. And revenue miles are miles traveled while in revenue service. Now there's a note under both of these that in the current performance formula, for commuter routes greater than 20 miles, we also include deadhead miles in these measures. And so that addresses some of the concerns that we heard from some of our longer distance commuter systems that wanted us to include that there. Another concept here, passenger miles traveled. That's the cumulative sum of all distance traveled by each passenger. So we use this in the commuter rail sizing pool, which I'll get to momentarily, and then we estimate it for most agencies. We only have a small number, I think maybe 8 agencies throughout the state that report this figure to NTD, and so we use those to then synthesize information for other agencies. And again, I'll get to that momentarily. And then I included a concept here that I'm going to repeat throughout talking about the methodology, which is size weight. So this is a factor that's calculated as a function of all the sizing metrics that go into the formula, and that's normalized across the state. And it's a key piece in how we determine what a final allocation is. So also, before getting into the actual weights and measures, I wanted to just speak a little bit about where we get data to just remind everybody kind of what's within the realm of possibility as far as metrics go. We don't have access to every single metric that could be used in a formula like this. And so it's good to keep in mind where we get this and how we generate it. So for ridership, revenue miles, and hours, these are reported monthly in our OLGA system and aggregated for annual measures. For the miles and hours for those commuter routes, those are reported directly to program managers for the deadhead miles to incorporate those into the calculations. For PNC, like I mentioned a moment ago, agencies that are required to report to the NTD are also required to report to us in OLGA. And then for all other agencies, we synthesize their PMC using an average of the statewide reporters. Then we drop out the outliers for the longer commuter routes, and then we multiply that average by the ridership for those agencies. So we synthesize it for those agencies that are not doing the sampling that would result in a PMC measure. And then for operating costs for sizing and performance, those are the annual operating systems applications that provide that information, verified with the CAFRs that are submitted to us by each of those agencies. All right, so these next 5 slides step through each of the steps included in the operating formula. And I do apologize, some of this gets quite technical, so please slow me down and ask me to repeat as we go through. So the first step in the operating formula is the commuter rail sizing. And this is due to the unique cost structure of commuter rail. It receives a unique treatment as far as the sizing process goes. This only applies to one agency in the state, and that's VRE. So there are only commuter rail services. So the way we calculate this is by comparing the percent of VRE's passenger miles traveled, PMC, revenue miles, and revenue hours to the state totals for each metric. In this sizing metric, each of those count equally at 33%. And then using this, we calculate a commuter pool size weight for that agency. So PMC, VRH, VRM all go into this equally to get their size weight. The second step is then completing our transit size. In this step, we calculate a transit size weight factor for all of the agencies in the state, besides VRE. And this is calculated for all of those agencies using a combination of metrics that are different weights that are illustrated here. So operating costs is weighted at 50%, ridership at 30%, and then hours and miles are at 10% each. If the sum of all of the size weight factors, including VRE, don't equal 100% across all agencies, we then normalize to make small adjustments. And this is where things get kind of complicated. So
This is where things get complicated.
and you know, so the size weights that are calculated are then adjusted by 5 performance metrics to create what's referred to as a size performance weight. Okay, so it's a weighting that takes into account both the sizing metrics and the performance metrics as well. So to do this, we use 3 years of historic data plus the most recent year, so 4 years total, to calculate a 3-year rolling average of the trends for each year. There is a change from the slides that we distributed last week here. The second bullet point under the first bullet point, second bullet under the first bullet point added. Just note that this is comparing trends. It's not comparing the raw values. It's comparing the changes compared to the overall state change. Okay, so then these size performance weights are normalized as well, so that everything equals 100%. And so the 5 performance metrics that we use for this are passengers per revenue hour, passengers per revenue mile, operating costs per revenue hour, operating costs per revenue mile, and operating costs per passenger.
Sorry, I had a quick question.
Yeah, okay.
So when you say that you're looking at the change, does that mean that an agency that say did a big network redesign and got a big ridership boost, within 4 to 5 years, it wouldn't score, or that performance adjustment weight would not be as high because it had stopped changing after the redesign? Am I understanding that right?
For the performance adjustments, that is essentially how it works, yes. But ridership also goes into the sizing measure.
Yeah.
So there's also a kind of performance measure that's in the sizing. And so that would be reflected there. Gotcha.
And the sizing metrics have the most impact. The performance metrics, where you are relative to that statewide trend, above or below, makes little adjustments. Okay. I think it's important to keep in mind.
Thank you. Okay. All right. So then the fourth step is the original funding allocation. At this point, each agency has 5 normalized size weight performance factors, which are then multiplied by the weighting assigned to each of the performance metrics, which is 7% each, summed up and then multiplied by the total funding available. The sum of that is the agency's total operating allocation for that year. So I can repeat that because this is the key here, is that we take these normalized size performance weights and we multiply them each by 10%. So each of them are worth an equal amount, and then that overall amount is multiplied by the available state operating systems in that year, which divvies up the operating systems based on those size performance weights. Okay. So then the final step is applying a funding cap. So there's a 30% cap set on operating systems allocation for any given agency. And the cap is based on the FY19 audit expenses, and the 30% threshold was also informed by the highest operating systems grant that was received in FY19, which was the year prior to this going into effect.
And Dan, can I just stop there for a second? Just for the folks that weren't on TSDAC through the adventures we had in 2018, this cap and redistribution step was added because there's concern for some of the smaller systems that had, their performance looked really good, and a lot of them were 5311 eligible systems that were getting federal to take care of their operating as well, and a need to kind of smooth out, for lack of a better word, how that operating funding got distributed so that we didn't have these peaks. And so that's what Dan's getting at with looking back at 18 and looking at 19 allocations and kind of seeing where that top was and establishing that threshold so that we're kind of when people hit that bar, whatever would have gone up goes back through and gets redistributed. We hit the 30% cap for everyone for fiscal 23, just because of the size of the program, because of the revenue the revenue that's running through the fiscal 23 program. That's very unusual. So before that, it would be a handful of agencies that would hit it.
So is that a good thing or a bad thing?
It's a good thing.
Is that a benefit that the cap was in place?
Yes. Yeah. I think the last couple of years have been an anomaly. We're in what somebody said earlier, the COVID time warp or whatever. I think we will go back to seeing the cap affect a handful of agencies, the majority of which are small rural agencies that have 5311 for the rest of their operating assistance. And that was a concern out of this group when this was developed, and that's why we came up with that 30% cap. So you didn't. Vice Chair Messer will recall she loved her scatter plots, and there were a number of agencies that were based on the formula alone would have received more money than their operating costs just because of their performance.
Okay, got it.
So there were some anomalies. Yeah. That's why I wanted to jump in, because it wasn't just to kind of put a restrictor on the allocation of funding. It was really to make sure that people weren't getting more than what they needed overall.
Okay, so when they did get more than what they needed in the past, then what happened to those funds? Just curious.
It was driven by the ridership and the operating. It was driven by the change in the formula, not so it didn't happen in the past.
It did not. Okay, got it.
So the second bullet point is having the money over 30% gets redistributed in the program.
Okay.
So thank you for the clarification on that. But after we apply the cap, any system that would receive through the formula more than 30%, taking them down to 30%, and redistribute throughout the other agencies that haven't hit their 30% cap. And I guess we'll pause here with respect to this step of the actual allocation and how we run it. So if there's other questions on any of these other slides,
not a question, but this is back to my visual thing, because they're individual slides versus. Could we just do a quick set of the slides for the ones we have the nice graphics where you show in the colors 50, 30, and 10, just so we kind of visualize again this formula, because we don't have one slide that shows the delightful formula. So like 37.
Yeah, right. So yeah, the first step is computer rail sizing. It gets specific treatment in its size weight creation based on PMC, revenue hours, miles, compared to the rest of the state. All of those are weighted equally in their calculation.
I think this is an important example, and then think it slow, it's like this is 1/3, and that's it, so there was some really work behind these percentages that look pretty simple, quote unquote, now. And it's the visualization of what it's appreciated.
But yeah, so commuter rail sizing, and if you go to the next one, it is significantly different than how we do sizing for the other agencies, which takes into account operating costs at 50%, ridership at 30%, hours and miles at 10 and 10. Next slide. Also shows how those performance metrics are then weighted. Equal weighting across all factors. So I will note here that some of them have an inverse relationship, so we want to incentivize decreasing costs. So that we take into account costs actually positive if you have a negative score, right? whereas the first two are a direct relationship. Okay? Lots of math. All right, so let's go ahead to slide 4. So these next few slides just kind of summarize the current operating formula in practice. It also summarizes the input data that was used and kind of highlights some of the issues that we've had throughout the pandemic. The pandemic really did have a big impact on the metrics that are used in the operating formula and how we ultimately would distribute those funds. So, and it ultimately came down to the issue that during a time where customer safety and security were the two most important concerns to our agencies, it wasn't really fair for DRPT to be distributing operating funds based on the performance of those services. So we were encouraging agencies throughout the state to really concentrate on customer safety. And so because of that, the way that we've used this formula, especially over the past 3 years, or 2 years rather, has been good. So FY20 represented the first year we ran the formula, but there's some significant caveats in FY20. So the first section in each one of these slides is organized the same way. The first section here highlights the data that we use, and the second illustrates additional operating funds that became available to agencies during each fiscal year. These additional funds simply illustrate that the agencies may not even necessarily felt the full impact of the new formula because of additional operating funds that came in. So for FY20, the data that was used was what was prescribed by the formula. So for costs, for sizing and performance, we look back at FY18, which was the last audited at the time. For performance, for sizing, we looked at FY18 because it was the last year we had on file, and then for performance for those performance metrics, we looked at 15 for 4 years. A couple of notes here though. In FY20, we phased the sizing metrics. So it wasn't 50, 30, and 10. We kept it 60% cost, 20% ridership, 10% hours a month. In addition, transition assistance was provided. Now we didn't do this in a not hold harmless way. So what we did was we looked at the new formula versus what the previous formula would have given agencies in FY20, and we provided the difference. Thank you. Appreciate it. Yeah. So then in the spring of 2020, that's when COVID hit. And so additional operating funds came into all of the agencies through the CARES Act in March of 2020, and then through some DRPT COVID operating assistance that was provided in April of that year. Again, that's just to illustrate that the state and federal allocations that year were not the only sources of operating funds for a lot of people.
Hey, Dan, just can you make sure that you're consistent and loud and stuff? Thank you.
I'm sorry. All right, so in FY21, this actually represents the only year where we ran this formula in its complete intended form. So the data that was used, again, was 2 years back for cost for sizing and performance. For the metrics used for sizing, we used 19 data. For the performance metrics, we used 16 to 19. And so it represented exactly what was prescribed by the policy. A couple of notes here. We used the true sizing metrics that were spelled out in that policy, 50% for cost, 30 for ridership, 10 for hours and miles, and there was no transition assistance provided. So it did represent a year where we allocated funds based on the intended formula. In addition, however, CARES Act and the COVID relief funds did carry over because those were allocated pretty late in the year, and ARPA came online in March of 2020. So there was a bunch more funds. So moving forward to FY22, one note here that you'll see at the top of the FY22 and 23 is the same point that you just made, that we've had a lot more state operating funds in the program than usual, which has allowed for higher than usual allocation levels. In addition, we made some decisions to pause using the most recent performance data due to those fluctuations that I mentioned resulting from the pandemic. And so for FY22, we ran the formula using the sizing and performance metrics that were used in the previous cycle. So from FY19, we carried those forward. For ridership for sizing, we also carried FY19 forward. And for the performance metrics, we carried forward the 16 to 19 performance metrics. In addition, that year, which is this current fiscal year, state PTS and uplift funds that came in late 2021 allowed us to bring agencies up to the 30% level as well. So the allocation of operating assistance from the state in FY22 is significantly higher than in other years. Similarly, in FY23, we also had a lot more money running through the program, so we were able to provide 30% across the board. That said, we did run the formula using a carry forward for ridership, for sizing, and for performance metrics. So it was FY19 and FY16 and 19, but we based the cost for sizing and the cost for performance on the audited FY21 data. And so that 30% cap was set based on FY21, which is how the formula spells out how we should be determining that cap. And that is it for that section. So I will stop here. I know this is a lot, but I guess the big takeaway is that the only year that it was run in its true form was FY21. And that comes back in the future slide here. And we've had an influx of operating funds that have come into the state in 22 and 23, which allowed us to provide a higher than usual allocation to agencies. And of course, there was FY20 where we had some transition assistance and we did some phasing of the sizing metrics. That's the overall summary.
So this is where things start to get difficult because those of us that went through 2018 worked very, very hard to get to this. And we haven't been able to use it because of COVID. And now it's how do you unwind what has happened with COVID, which has not treated transit agencies the same, and honor the intent of the law, which is to award funding based on performance, but also go back to those 5 principles that we worked on in 2018. I don't have an answer for that. I'm going to say that's the problem that's in front of us. And I think we said it last time. We've kind of watched FTA, and FTA has put a pause on their metrics and things as well for the same reason. I've been like, please let me know how you're going to unravel this, and I think we're going to go before them. So we're going to have to figure out how to, I don't know what the appropriate analogy is. We're going to have to figure out how to thread a needle. And so what we've got, like in the rest of the package, is kind of show you, we go back to where we are, and what that means. That's not a recommendation. I want to make sure that everybody understands. That's just showing everybody, here's where we are today with the formula we have based on where we are with ridership. I can tell you that returning ridership to our system, getting back to some kind of normal, new normal, I don't know what the right term is a very high priority for the administration. One of the things I've been told many times is a key focus, and that's why you see us doing some of the things that we're doing. We got to figure out how to do that until some other things happen, like in Northern Virginia, the return of the federal workforce to the office, and there's no idea when that's going to happen. The commuter services are in a not great place. And so there's a lot of things that are outside of our control. So just wanted to preface before we show numbers, everybody gets really shocked and they go straight to, we all do this. They go straight to their line on the chart to see what's in it for me and where are we going to go. And I'll close with this. We all do that. It's human nature. I would wonder about you if you didn't do that, but we also need to think about the bigger picture. And so I'll stop and throw it back to Dan.
And Mr. Chair, this is Kate Mattice, and I really appreciate Jen's comments, because I think one of the things that's very clear is that I know DRPT is being asked to provide a statewide approach, and the way things are occurring is not consistent across the state. I think we recognize that. I think there's some very promising things happening. There is a federal workforce returning, et cetera. And so, part of it is a point in time when the data, and that's where I'm going to focus my questions on, is sort of how does this look? Because I think if you're even to look from January until now, you're going to see some huge changes in the way transit ridership is moving, and different types of systems are rebounding here in Northern Virginia. And so I think every part of the state is moving a little bit differently. And so what does that mean? And so that's where I'm framing this from, is that, I keep saying sort of like, hold it, we're almost there, I just don't think we're there, depending on when this data was cut. If it truly is from last year, I think there's some opportunities for a conversation. So.
And I think, Kate, to your point, I mean, we're tracking ridership here on a monthly basis. We're working towards having that all on our open data portal in the near future. So we see the same things you're seeing. It's how you put that into an annual operating formula and get something out of it that has meaning. But I'm very encouraged by what I'm seeing.
Yeah, I know the Metro numbers have been up.
Metro numbers have been up. VRE is up every single week. They're getting better. We're tracking in the right direction. But I think this is, and this is where I try to carry the message of we need to be patient, because that's not going to happen overnight. But at the same time, what we can't have is everybody returning to the workforce in a single occupant vehicle, because then we're just going to have gridlock. And that's not good for any of us. And so trying to figure out how we either message or, engage folks to get back on transit, that's something we're trying to do here and now.
A couple of macro thoughts, and I do appreciate Jen and Kate's points before we jump into the details. Because one, I went back to slide 33 because I think it's helpful those roles of mind where Dan started us, because fiscal responsibility, robust transit, getting people back riding, keeping the safety for our patrons, all of that is still, from my perspective, still core and relevant. I do think the core formula foundation, and thanks for my cheat sheet, is still relevant, but we have the issues that everybody's identified. So I feel like at a macro level, without in the details and how are we going to do it, I feel like we're going to do like we did when we started. We had a transition in. Now we're going to have to transition out. But I also think we're going to have to acknowledge that we want to get ridership back. We want to get our numbers back. We go up, but it's going to be different. So yes, we're coming out of COVID, but we're going to have changes like remote work, those type of things that are going to impact it. So I think we need to transition out, and good thing for state code most of the time, and in this case, 3 years, it'll be really important for us to look at this again. So those are sort of my macro thoughts as I'm thinking about it going into the deeper dive. Thanks for going back to the goals that are in front of us.
Any other comments at this stage?
All right, so going back to slide 47. The next series of slides illustrates really key changes that we noted between the FY19 performance figures and the FY21. A couple things I just want to say here, getting at a lot of the points that were just mentioned. These summary slides do not include FY22 data, which is showing that uptick. Now, the uptick in ridership and various other metrics is happening statewide, but it's happening in kind of a lumpy way in different places at a different rate. And so these slides do highlight the worst performance data during the pandemic. And so the point of including it was just to include kind of some of the major changes and shifts that we saw over the past 2 years in order to set the context for how we're coming out of it. So I wanted to preface everything by saying, next slide, please. So I organized this by step in the formula and what we look at. So for commuter rail sizing, PMT, hours and miles are what are used. And so this slide looks at PMT statewide, VRE's PMT, and the following slide looks at VRE's PMT compared to statewide PMT, passenger miles traveled. So what we see here is that pre-pandemic, VRE, the passenger miles traveled, in FY19 were over 135 million. FY21, that went down to 10.7, which represented a 92% decline. So they're coming out from this, but this is the kind of the starting point of where we're coming from, coming out. So a little bit more importantly here, this shows the share of VRE's PMT compared to passenger miles traveled statewide. So FY19 is about 30% of the passenger miles traveled statewide that was traveled on VRE systems. Coming out, or in the middle of the pandemic, FY21 accounted for 11% of the PMT statewide, which is 62% of the cost. So that has a significant impact on the size weight calculation for commuter rail. So this chart here summarizes statewide transit ridership between FY16 and 21, but my change calculations are really focused on FY19 versus 21. So what we saw during the pandemic was a 53% decline statewide in ridership. Again, ridership is recovering in 2022, or FY22. It's not reflected in this chart, but it is reflected in a scenario that we run for next year. Next slide. So this is really the key here. From this slide and the next one, I know this is a little hard to read, there's a lot on here. This represents the upper two quartiles as far as ridership goes in the state, and it shows those declines by agency. And you can see here that the declines were not even across the board. On the low end, VRE ridership was down about 92%, Blacksburg 83%, and on the higher end, GRTC was down 13%, Petersburg Transit down 19%. And so that's a big range of change. Similarly, for the bottom quartile, we saw similar ranges where Pony Express and Chincoteague declined by 87%. Now that's a seasonal service in a very tourist-centered area of the state. And the city of Bristol declined by 72%. Whereas on the lower end of the decrease, we had Lake Country and Suffolk, which both dropped by about 17%, and the town of Albany, which dropped by about 21%. I'm going to go kind of quickly through this because it's just kind of for context, but I'm happy to stop and go back to other slides. So hours and miles, they also decreased during the pandemic, but they did not decrease as much. So statewide, hours decreased by 11%, and some of these figures have changed because I made some tweaks to some of the numbers that were going into this, but it's generally the same trend as what you all saw in your slides last Friday. This measure again counts as 10% of the sizing. It's included in 2 of the 5 of the metrics, and so it does have an impact on the ultimate allocation that happens here. So yeah, next one, which shows the real story happening here. So some agencies had actually increases in service hours between 19 and 21. Fairfax Connector, GRTC, or 2 agencies there showed a slight uptick. Others decreased significantly. Ottawa County was down by 50%, VRE 37%, John 34%. Similarly, on the next slide, for the lower quartile, we see similar ranges. And so it's kind of the same story here, is that we have this statewide average, but each of the agencies have a very different profile within it. So some of the agencies on this list increased by significant amounts, 17, 15% for Star and Pony. CSPDC and Danville Transit were down 9 up 9.7%. Whereas on the low end, radar had a 49% decrease, and we're still at 48%. That's kind of how to read these charts. And so I'll go a little quicker through the next one, because this is going to mostly.
Dan, just a question for a second. I'm sorry. Obviously, the role of federal government, the role of the federal money, and the policy decisions that were of a priority during the pandemic, many of our systems were told to keep, the whole thing was to keep people employed and keep buses running. So I just want to be mindful that the service being provided in many ways was because there was a very strong push to keep those services running. So I don't know how that gets reflected in the data, if that's what you're seeing, but I know here in Northern Virginia, it was very clear that our services were to continue as much as possible because that was the federal government's priority, was to make sure we weren't laying anybody off. So I don't know how that works.
Yeah, that's a great point. And so in both hours and miles, that's the reason why we didn't see as severe declines, because we were keeping up the levels of service close to where they were before from many agencies. Some agencies were increasing their level of service. Some agencies...
Well, and in some instances, people were not running service, but they still had to pay employees because that was a part of the deal, right? So
certainly,
it's something to be mindful of, right?
That's a good point, and that would have been reflected in the operational costs. But some agencies also were running multiple buses for one frequency because of social distancing requirements. If GRTC was one that was doing that. So yeah, so the data doesn't tell the whole story when just looking at the change figures. But yeah, it's a good point on guidance statewide and from federal government. So for miles, there was a 14% decline statewide between 19 and 21. Again, this measure also counts for 10% of the sizing in 2 of the 5 performance metrics. And then agency by agency, high variation as well. One agency increased service hours, others decreased slightly. Fairfax, GRTC, Loudoun Metro on this list. Others decreased significantly, Loudoun County and the area. And in the lower quartile, similar ranges. Blackstone, City of Suffolk, all increased slightly, whereas agency City of Bristol decreased significantly. And so this all moves us into our discussion on operating scenarios moving forward. So that was just to kind of set the context of where we're coming from. There is an uptick in 22. We don't have a full picture of what 22 looks like because we're still in it. And so in order to move this conversation along, we had to do 2 things for the operating system scenario piece here. The first, we had to determine what our baseline was for comparison. For the past couple of years, we've had really high levels of operating funding available, which allowed us to keep the percentages relatively high, but that's not necessarily indicative of what future years will be like. Second thing we had to do was calculate a projected performance allocation for FY21 using the current formula to kind of illustrate what that would have looked like if no changes were made, which would then inform this committee's approach to recommending changes. So I'll pause here before I go into this and see if there's any questions on any of or additional questions rather on the performance data.
And as we pause, lunch is here. If we want to pause long enough to grab lunch and come back before we get into this next section.
Sure, that's fine.
Okay.
All right.
So for the folks that are on the phone, we'll take a brief pause.
All right, we're going to go ahead and get back into things here. Just a note, as we're eating lunch, try to keep the wrestling to a minimum for those joining by the phone. I've switched locations to be a little closer to try to minimize that, but yeah, anyway, okay. So.
You actually sound so much clearer, thank you.
Oh, good.
And Dr. Smoot, we muted you, so just, we'll get you back on.
All right, next slide, please. So
For the purposes of this year's operating assistance work, we've chosen FY21 to be our baseline for analysis for multiple reasons. One, like I mentioned a moment ago, it represents the only time the formula was run as intended, and there was no transition funding, there was no phasing of the metrics. It also was a year where we included pre-pandemic metrics for sizing and performance, which does help illustrate the impacts of these recent trends. Another reason is that the funding allocated that year was somewhat comparable to what's projected for FY 2024, and not what we've seen over the past 2 years. Now, somewhat comparable is still an increase. In FY 21, we had $101.5 million to distribute, and in FY 24, we are projecting 114 to 115 million to distribute. In these more recent years, when more funding was available, and we carried forward the pre-pandemic era performance metrics, we didn't get a real idea of how the performance formula would play out. So that is why we landed on FY21. And so the next two slides illustrate the FY21 operating allocation of $101.5 million. The first one here shows the upper two quartiles of those that received these funds, and the second slide shows the lower two quartiles. The blue bar here is in both slides, the blue bars are the actual allocations, but the orange is also the actual allocation, just to show what this is going to look like on future slides. So for future slides, and what we'll do going forward is we will illustrate the baseline of FY21 as this orange trend line, so we can compare to that. Okay, next slide, please. So this slide is getting at our FY24 projected scenario. So we're calling it scenario 1 because it's the first one that we're running. We plan to run more and present in future meetings, but this is our starting point. So the key part to pay attention to here is the data used, just so everybody's on the same page. So for costs for sizing and performance, we're relying on the FY21 audited budgets. This represents the most recent year that we have audited information for, and unfortunately the timing of the conversation that we're having right now means that we don't have FY22 audited figures in line, which will be what next year's formula is based on. I think we all recognize that this is not ideal, but audited figures are much better than budgeted figures for a lot of reasons. Namely that our finance staff goes through a full process and backs out the budgets to reflect what was actually spent. For ridership, hours and miles, we are using FY19 to FY22 data, and there's a note here that FY22 is projected. So since we're still in FY22, we do not have a complete year of performance metrics. So what we did here is we used historic trends and the first 9 months of this year to project the rest of the year. So the historic trends helped us with percentages pre-pandemic, but the actual levels were set based on what we're seeing this year. It was kind of a best guess approach to how the next 3 months will play out. For PMT, for commuter rail sizing, we ended up having to synthesize this for all agencies, including reporters. Again, this is a function of the timing of this conversation. We don't have this data reported for FY22 as of today. And so the technical notes below just talk to a little about what I just kind of outlined and explain how we synthesized PMT for both reporters and non-reporters. And I guess I'll just summarize that without trying to get too technical here. What we did for our PMT reporters was we looked at historic data reported to us and took a 3-year average of 19 to 21 reported data to set their average ridership or average miles per rider. And we use those averages to create a statewide average. So we're kind of taking averages of averages to apply to the agencies that do not report. I'm happy to get into the details of that, but I think for now that should suffice. So, next slide, please. Here we finally get to see what we're looking at as far as the FY24 allocation goes, using a best guess scenario of what we will see next year. So again, the first slide illustrates the upper two quartiles. Blue bars here represent the FY24 projected allocation. The orange trend line illustrates the FY21 allocation that we're comparing to. The red dashes, which is introduced here, illustrate the 30% cap. So that shows who's reaching that cap, approaching it, not approaching it. And I just wanted to note here that we did this based on the projected FY24 operating assistance funds available. So that across the top is listed at $114.7 million, $114.8 million. And so we're not comparing apples to apples between FY24 and 21, but we wanted to show real projected funding levels. So we used the projected amount that we're going to have. So next slide, please. This slide just uses a couple of arrows here to illustrate the agencies in the upper two quartiles that will be experiencing a likely reduction in operating assistance compared to FY21. So those include VRE, Loudoun County, and GLCC in Lynchburg. The VRE reduction is nearly 60%, Loudoun County 30%, and the GLCC is 37%. GLCC, I will note here, they've had a lot of changes going on out there, and I'm sure Brian can speak to this. They lost the Liberty University service over the past couple of years, which is part of why their projected allocation is coming down, and they've really struggled getting some ridership back out there. So because they lost the university routes. The other two agencies that are experiencing a drop here are commuter heavy routes, and so what we're seeing statewide as far as FY22 ridership trends go is that a lot of the local services are creeping back with their ridership levels, but the commuter services, the long-haul commuter services, are not coming back as quickly. And so that's reflected here. And we can jump back to all of these for discussion, but I'll just go through this and then we can kind of come back to it. So next slide. The green arrows on this slide illustrate not just those agencies that are projected to have an increase, but those that are projected to have more than a 20% increase. So there's some like HRT, which we're projecting an 8% increase on here. I just didn't highlight it because the whole thing would be full of arrows. So some of the agencies, GRTC in Richmond, Fairfax County, Jaunt have significant, and Arlington and Alexandria here as well, I believe, yes, have significant increases compared to the FY21 real allocation. Next slide, please. Nope, we lost our slide first.
Sorry. All right.
Look at technology.
All right, so this illustrates the same information for the lower two quartiles. A little bit more variation here, but here, I'll just advance it to this one. So again, this illustrates those agencies that are projected to get a lower amount of state operating assistance than they got in FY21. So that includes Radar, Farmville, and Chincoteague Pony Express. And this slide, this slide illustrates those that are increasing by at least 20%, which is the majority on here. And so then the final illustration that we have is a scatter plot here, which shows total change in dollars on the x-axis versus percentage change on the y, and it shows the spread across the whole state to get a sense of scale here. And so on the increase end, I mean, GRTC is a outlier in terms of both percentage and actual dollars, and on the low end, VRE is a outlier in the decrease. So we didn't include all of the names of the agencies on here because it was getting too crowded. So this just illustrates all of those agencies that are projected to have a decrease and those that are expected to have a 25% or so or more increase. I guess with the exception of HRT, which snuck in there too. But yeah, that is the long and short of the story. And so, again, we can flip back and talk about all of these, but the whole point of the work that we're engaging in this year is that we're going to work with our consultants and with this committee to create and test some additional operating formula scenarios that address the projected that we're looking at here. Those additional scenarios could look at the metrics and weights that we use for sizing. So we currently use operating costs, ridership, and hours and miles at 50%, 30, 10, and 10. We could look at adjusting those percentages, introducing other measures. For performance metrics, we can look at those as well. The methodology that we use to calculate the commuter rail sizing pool, which is currently based on passenger miles traveled, hours and miles, and then changes or adjustments to the 30% cap. In addition to this, it's not listed here, we do have the opportunity to possibly introduce other metrics, but I would encourage you all to try to think within the realm of possibility for what we select, because we do not have access to everything. But yeah, that is kind of our starting point for our conversation this year. And so I'm happy to flip back or refer to any of the slides that you all would like.
If I could just add one more point, I think, just to make sure everybody understands, we don't have to change anything.
It's true.
What we're required to do by code is to go back and look at how effective our capital prioritization and the operating formula are, and then look at any changes if we want to make them. So I just want to make sure that everybody understands that's baseline. We can run all kinds of scenarios, and we've run all kinds of scenarios, and we have had many scatter plots that move people around, and so we can run as many scenarios as you want to. I keep wanting to bring us back to, we've only run this and used this one time, and so do we want to, I guess what I'm trying to get the sense out of TSDAC is, do we want to start tinkering with it, or do we want to focus on how do we back our way out of COVID, and then maybe it's something else? I'm throwing you a curveball, but
no, you're fine.
Kind of, as the more we've talked and stuff, I just wanted to say that like we don't have to change anything.
And so that's really what I think is our first discussion is basically how to improve, which obviously all of our hard work and effort into a TSDAC. I guess the sense we want to have is, was it working as far as we went? Was there anything that popped out in that first real run that made us say we missed something, or the weights are not right? And if we're generally satisfied that the structure of the program looks right, but couldn't possibly have accommodated the impact of COVID, the question becomes, how do we then deal with that short term as the system get back to functioning?
Yeah, and I think I just want to make sure, Dr. Smoot, can we hear you? Yeah, we can't hear you. I think you're muted.
Did we mute him here?
Yeah, I did, but I think I unmuted. Mary Levesque, can you check and make sure
I need to know what system you're using, Dr. Smoot, because I have some people.
Okay.
There we go.
I think I'm here. What impact, if any, does free or reduced fare programs have on these calculations?
So the free or reduced fare is not a factor in the operating formula, but pretty much across the board where it's been implemented, the ridership has gone up significantly, which
Right.
was the goal of the TRIP program.
Okay, thank you.
Chair. As perhaps the elephant in the room, Mr. SEC.
Yeah, blue on your
I do want to say it's great for our agency to kind of come in and say it's not necessarily fair. I certainly don't like to see so many of us profiting from VRE's pain. So I guess a starting point I would like to see is I would like to see what this allocation would look like without any cap, just to get a better understanding of kind of how the core formulas are driving the core metrics of VRM, VRH, ridership, and TMT in VRE's case and cost. I'd like to see that, because I think before we start tweaking formulas or think about tweaking formulas, it would be nice to know what are those core metrics doing to the existing formula.
I think that's a great thing. And it does suggest to me that one of the things that might be helpful is to get a better handle on the sense of how individual systems appear to have been impacted by COVID, because I think there is a significant variation.
And Mr. Chair, Kate Mattias, if I could, I mean, and obviously the where we're seeing with VRE's loss, I mean, we've got to figure out some sort of solution for a single agency to see that kind of loss in state aid would be catastrophic. I know we're here to solve that problem, but I just had to make sure I put my words out on that. Obviously, I'm representing Virginia Transit Association. We have winners and losers in all of this. Even in Northern Virginia, we do. But yeah, we've got to be able to do some sort of troubleshooting that we don't have that. I mean, this is just completely, blowing out of the water, especially as we know that system is heavily dependent on commuters that are just starting to come back on board.
And Kate, if it makes you feel any better, I will reinforce that the Commonwealth is right there with VRE, with the Transforming Rail in Virginia initiative and the I-95 corridor, obviously. And we are very focused on VRE success and, looking into the future of rail in that corridor and seeing VRE have some options to provide services that they can't provide today. And so I'm right there. I'm right there with you. I understand.
No, I know. Look, it's the way numbers run. I mean, I get it.
Yeah, I know we have VRE folks listening, so I just want to make sure they heard me say that.
I know we talked about not tinkering with this process, but just as a note, VRE ridership isn't really, it's growing, but based on what they've said and they've reported, it's not going to be right for a long time. So if there are special considerations that we may want to do for commuter type service, whether it's VRE or other folks, whether it's, redistributing to them first or something to that effect, but this is like a long haul problem that's not going to change. So I do think that if, the goals of the state or the Commonwealth, DRPT, et cetera, is to still make sure that's viable for the future. The data is never going to support in the next, according to VRE, 2 to maybe 2026, I thought was the number I heard, where they think they'll be back to normal. It's going to be a while. So overall, I don't see much that I have a major issue with. I think when it relates to your transit plan or your TDP, there may be some challenges because you're going to have that gap. But I didn't see any major red flags from my perspective looking at some agencies to say this may not be great for commuter service, but everything else seemed to shake out a little bit. And then the only other, I would say, normalization item I would say would just be related to, and I know it's covered in revenue, miles and hours, is that, there are still a bunch of us that are not back to pre-pandemic levels because you don't have the staff to do it. And that just made me sorry for your luck and wait for your TSP to tell you to do something different, and I'm okay with that. But I do just want to say that it's something to consider, that some ridership levels are never going to get to that normal. So if there's a way to, whether it's for commuter service or elsewhere, to pull maybe a little bit out from the winners, to put in I'll call it a fund, but that's probably not what you should do. just to help offset some of those items that would be helpful, because I just think for many of us, it's going to be a 2 to 4 year time period before normalization happens. I'm not sure for this process it can wait that long.
And one of the things that we had talked about, and just so everybody knows, Grant is listening, and he's like, so I'm also speaking for him in this. We've talked about, you know, is there a way to, in this period of transition, and I think you hear the same kind of time frame for Metro and other big transit systems, like we're going to need to show some patience for recovery, and none of us have a lot of that. I mean, it's just, that's human nature. So is there something that we can do over that recovery period to put some guardrails around the program? And, you know, I don't know how that's to couch that, but that's something that we've kind of talked about. Is there a way to do that, you know, still allows performance to factor into the formula, because we're required to do that, but does put a buffer there to get to your point that helps balance out? Because what I don't think any of us want to do is to see something so detrimental, you know, lead to, you know, impacting how service is provided in a negative way that doesn't allow for those systems to come back.
Yeah, I think you have to have some kind of buffer system, because the point is, if you don't, and they start to go downhill, it's going to cost you more in the future to have to deal with it. So you may as well put something in place now, at least minimize that, so that at least you're keeping people competitive, operable in this interim. So I would move in that direction to put some kind of buffer in place. And your idea of setting aside a fund, I mean, that concept, I think, is one we ought to explore, because there are some folks, as you said, who will be winners and who will do well. But to the extent that we can maybe set aside some of these funds to help address the buffer question, we ought to do it.
Yeah, like if you are at the top and you would have gotten X, there's a percentage amongst those agencies that can just be pulled in and then redistributed, maybe a little bit differently, or maybe the same as you do the 30%. But I think that is the only way to kind of resolve that issue, working within the funding you have and just letting agencies know. We still have to make sure that we're, you know, lifting as we climb all together, because if not, it could be you lose service in that area, period, because there's only a couple of routes left.
And putting on my economic development goes Virginia also. The idea of keeping every part of the Commonwealth competitive and able to attract business and to address how do we move people around the workforce. We don't want any part of the system to deteriorate and us have to deal with it later. I think it's in our own best interest to provide that buffer right now. And as I said, it will save money in the long term, because you're going to have to pay for it eventually at some point, and it's going to cost you even more later.
So I do think that maybe before considering something like a set aside, we should really investigate the formula option first, so that it does stay performance-based as much as possible. For something like VRE, I wonder if, you know, we could give them the flexibility of, since the passenger metrics are kind of normalized by VRM, VRH, and ridership or costs, would it be helpful to give them the flexibility of saying you can use PMT or PMT, whichever ends up being more beneficial to you with that weighting? Because maybe travel patterns have changed. Maybe there's more people making shorter trips, you know, as a proportion of their ridership. Would something like that help them? But I want to help VREs and make sure that we're still able to provide this service, that everyone can provide service, but at the same time, you do still want to celebrate the success of something like, GRTC going fare free, and how that has, if ridership, it doesn't need to be that high. Definitely, that's not what we want, but I do think it is important to kind of really exhaust our options with performance metrics first and dedicated.
And if I may, I agree 100% with what you're saying, Sam, and I do think it should still be in the confines of performance metrics, because even VRE, they did a presentation where they showed that some of those shorter trips are actually happening and people aren't making as much commute. They were doing like LaFont against something else. So they do have the data to support it. I want to make sure that I'm clear that I'm not saying I think we should just go into a subsidy program. Because I would say even for Fredericksburg Regional Transit, like, tell me we're getting less money because we sink. Yes, I know we sink. So we need that push to say, y'all need to get it together. So I do agree, it should still be in the confines of performance. And also, if we're getting there for FY24, letting agencies know that the plan is going to occur like in October, because we start our FY24 budget process. Well, we start it like basically now and have to be done by October. So that's a consideration too, that whatever we do, if it's going to be done for FY24, we start submitting our jurisdictional budget in October.
And so in terms of steps to get to that point, you know, we've got to get through TSDAC and then get something in front of the Commonwealth Transportation Board to change the board policy.
Yep.
And so ideally, we would be ready to go to the board and take something out that's been hopefully in public comment by September. Even though, I mean, this process is open and we'll have public comment through this process with, you know, a formal public comment period early in the fall as well. That's going to basically, that timeline is going to be determined by the work of this group.
I think for me, and maybe it's because I lived through developing the initial formula and the revision, because we've only done with 1 year and we want to stick to performance measures, I'm inclined to say we don't really change it dramatically right now. We've only implemented it once. And then plan for 2 years of an adjustment, that transition, whatever that is. Now, that said, I think there is value in doing a little bit deeper dive to what we're suggesting. You know, run this without the cap, run it with a different option of DRD for the impact. Because I am kind of intrigued with the scatter plots there, showing how the lower quartiles, not a major change right along that center line, and the other systems had more of a variation. So I was trying to, noodle that and understand the difference between the quartiles.
Yeah, so the lower quartiles, I mean, a lot of them have large percentage increases, but the amount of money they're getting is so small that they're going to hug that y-axis no matter what. Even if they had a 100% increase, doubling $250,000 is not going to get you far out on the.
Yeah, the part of it is the other thing is, of course, I did roll back this slide so to speak. We don't have to go there, but everything you all were just saying speaks to fiscal responsibility, keeping the robust transit service, making sure we have our paving to efficient operations. So if we're not great, we're going to get better. Making sure we have mobility for the economic development and supporting the social safety net. Because if we lose systems, it's probably in those areas where we actually need that social safety net. So I just want to keep it back there. And that's sort of why I really like stuff with baby out with bathwater in the middle of COVID recovery, having only used the formula sort of truly, because it wasn't really fully used because we had extra cares and COVID and ARPA and all that.
So I'll add to what I said earlier. Like we're required by code to look at the formula, so we're doing that. We're not required to make any changes, but I do think the other thing that we're required to do is to get back to a performance-based formula, because what we're doing right now is we're carrying forward pre-COVID, measures, and we've done that for a long time. I think 24 is going to have to reflect the COVID environment. It's going to be how we do that.
And theoretically, that's impacting everybody.
Mm-hmm.
It is, but it impacts everybody different.
Actually different. So
Exactly.
is that part of what has a COVID adjustment?
Yeah. The challenge really is that this is going to produce some very wild fluctuations. Imagine you start to plug in those numbers from the COVID years and then subsequent re-emergence. So for instance, GRTC is doing great, expanding its service, and its growth will probably look anemic compared to the growth that we'll see in some other systems as they recover from the pandemic.
That's right, and those performance adjustments are based on a trend line.
Right.
So, yeah, it's a good point.
So one thing that I've been sort of thinking about when it comes to COVID years, there's two distinct fiscal years that are, when you think of COVID, it's FY20 and FY21. Is there scenarios that, well, can a scenario be run that looks at those 2 years excluded, and so you would do like a 17, 18, 19, 22? I'm just thinking, is there a way for us to just sort of skip years and still keep that performance going? I know it's not going to be perfect, but I think looking at the scenario, that option is just to see what it yields.
So we've thought about that internally here a bit, and I mean, one of the things we've done is we've carried forward 19 to kind of fill in the FY20 and FY21 years, so you don't have those big fluctuations. However, I will say is that here, and I'll go back. Let's see if I can find it here. The ridership for the previous fiscal year weighs in really heavily in the sizing metric, whereas the trend is not as heavily weighted, right? So those trends, it's comparing to a statewide trend. So in a year where everybody's down, you're comparing how down you are to everybody. And so it's not a huge difference from the mean, if that makes any sense. Yeah. Right? So we're not looking at the whole numbers, we're looking at the change in that trend line. And so, yeah, we could do that, but I don't know that would make that big of a difference, because really the sizing metrics are what are going into creating these big fluctuations. So it's the ridership for the agencies that are not VRE, and it's PMT for VRE.
Okay, gotcha.
But yes, we can certainly look at it, and that's on our list of things to run as far as calculations go. It just may not get at that huge dip in VRE right there.
I was thinking about that, we've been doing sort of a 3-year rolling average. Why, instead of an adjustment to the subsidy, is it changes data we collect? Would that help account for changes? During COVID, but capture what people were doing before and hopefully covering.
So doing a rolling average of a longer period of time?
I don't know if that makes a dramatic difference when you look at the percentages. The other thing I want to remind us, and Dan said it at least twice, the data is a problem. We ended up with proxies for some of what we really wanted was outcomes. We didn't have the data to do what we really wanted. So especially the performance measures, they became what we could have the data and reliably and analyze. That's why I don't really want to do a major change yet. Because one, I don't know if we have the data, but two, even if we get it, we're probably not going to do it, or it's not relevant right now.
Okay, so there's some good ideas coming out of here that will advise our scenario development. It sounds like we want to look at what things would look like without the cap. We want to look at possibly making some changes to the commuter rail sizing calculations. Currently they use PMT, hours and miles, whereas transit agencies use cost, ridership, hours and miles, and so maybe we can find some solutions in creating parity across those different measures. And then also looking at possibly tweaking the time frame for some of the performance metrics, or carrying over some of the pre-pandemic performance metrics to fill those 2 kind of years that are down.
Dan, I'm going to throw out a radical suggestion
Go for it.
scenario. What if we run VRE through the same sizing metrics that we run everybody else?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. See what happens.
Yeah, and I think, sorry, go ahead, Kate.
Go ahead, Kate.
No, I was going to say, I think, and I know there's a handful of us were around when we did this 3 years ago. DRPT staff and your consultants did really an amazing, exhaustive job. I do hope that folks, I know we've got a weird thing going on now, and I always thought that VRE, and we already recognize it's kind of in a special spot. I'm happy to hear that we're not necessarily talking about like throwing out everything, because I think there's a lot of value. And again, if we find a way to look at VRE in the unique space that it is, and I think I'd heard somebody say, start taking that out and running the other stuff, I think we're going to have a better sense of sort of where we are. And so I just, if anything, to me, it's more like looking at the years of data and how to then throwing out the formula. Right? I just want to make sure we don't go down that path, because there was a lot of work done, and I think a lot of really good work done to understand how to create this formula that our current bus and, well, I guess it's our bus and light rail systems are operating under.
Thank you for that comment.
And if I may, back to what I was saying before, I don't think it looks too bad. I don't know if staff had concerns with how everything kind of fell out, but I don't think we should really start up all over. I'm not even saying for sure. I think we should separate anything for any other agencies. And I will be frank, I don't think we should take out any years of data. I think because what's going to happen is when somebody has a crappy year next year, they're going to say, hey, can you take that year out too? So I think starting with 2019 for me is okay. I don't understand, and this, talk to me like I don't know anything, because I don't, but the 30% cap, if we took out the cap, I'm not really sure what that's going to do. Can y'all explain that to me? Basically, Sam suggested if we took the cap off, then what would that do?
So what it would do, so the blue lines for the agencies that are essentially at that red tick mark, those blue lines could be significantly higher than the red mark.
Okay.
And so with these agencies, it'll be more exaggerated as far as a percentage above that.
So they could get more operating assistance.
Exactly.
Okay.
But what it shows is it's how the formula works without then setting a cap and redistributing.
Okay.
And so GRTC, I don't know. I mean, I can go back to the formulas we used to create this. I don't know how high they were off the top of my head prior to the 30% cap. I don't know if they were at 40% or 32%, and so that makes a big difference for a big agency.
Okay. Thank you for the explanation, because I didn't want to walk away and really not know what was going on.
No worries.
But yeah, I don't see anything. I think y'all did good work, and I don't know if any other members have any issues, but I just don't see anything where I'm like, this is awful.
So I think there's a pretty clear consensus that we want to really see this formula tested to really see if it works over a longer period of time. And the real question is, how do we address an anomalous situation?
And we can come back with some potential recommendations next time we meet.
Chair, I'm wondering, can somebody refresh my memory as to how we got to the 30% cap? Yeah, I know when we talked about the $2 million for capital, sort of where everything was, we had to look at it on inflation increases. But I can't quite remember. I know why we got to the cap. I just couldn't remember how we got to 30%.
I can't, and I think I'm the only one on staff that was here working on it. I know, I'm trying not to look at you, because I can't remember. I think we were looking at kind of where it was a little bit of a logical cutoff, and it was, to Dan's point, it was those systems in the lower two quartiles where the dollars weren't maybe as significant, but the percentage of the amount of their operating that was being covered by the state operating formula was off. And so if I recall correctly, and we have all that archived, and I will be happy to go back and look at it, and we can watch it again. We'll look in that and make sure we bring you back a clearer answer. You've done some of that.
Yeah, and so just looking at some of the old data, it seems like the 30% mark was based on the FY19 maximum operating allocation to any of the agencies in the state. And so I don't know that it was exactly 30%. It might have been around 30%.
I think it
was looking at the highest allocation rates under the traditional and performance combined. So that's what I could piece together. I wasn't involved in that conversation, of course, like Jen.
Yeah, we had a little caucus over here. We also think it might have been Harrisonburg and Blacksburg were sitting on 30%.
When you're talking about funding, I also think about it as it requires a 20% local match on operating, because you can have up to 50 for federal, at least for the small agencies.
Yeah. So the reason I asked that is I'm wondering, and it might be another scenario, we don't have a 30%, what does it look like? What does it look like if you were to sort of use that same analysis, but change the cap to what it looks COVID like now?
Okay.
Would that account for some of the nuances and differences of how people responded under COVID? I don't know, if it goes to 40 or 25, what, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Have an impact. So that might be
Look at that.
the only, because it's not really changing performance metrics or a sizing, is sort of an implementation. If that helps, I might feel comfortable trying a change there if the analysis showed it was worth.
So can I just ask for a quick clarification on that? So just, so changing the cap level you're referring to reflect what we've been distributing over the past couple of years?
That's what I'm thinking, like,
Okay.
maybe 21 would work because it was sort of our normal, but you'd have to account for CARES and ARPA, take that out. Or do we need the whole COVID period plus,
Okay. So I mean, just to make sure we understand the data on this together here, the 30% cap illustrated here is essentially the FY23 allocation, because we had enough money to fund people at 30%, and we're using the same cost information for this scenario because we don't have 22, right? And so we kept people at 30%. And so what we could do, I think what you're getting at is we could lower the cap to reflect that FY21 line, but what that would do is that we likely wouldn't distribute all of the funds because we've had an increase in the funding. And so we can look at a lower cap for sure. We could look at a 25% cap. We could look at various different approaches to this that get at like kind of where we were previously. But we certainly want the cap to be higher than what things were in 21.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to figure out, what would be the impact. It doesn't change, like, out of line. And having a little extra money might be okay if we need to do a COVID adjustment or some other.
Exactly. So if you drew it down to say 25% or even 20%, what it would do is it would take money away from the big winners here that are hitting the 30% cap and redistribute that to ones that aren't at the 25% cap yet. And so GRTC would come down and that money would get redistributed. So
Greg, that would be great.
Well, you'll find the scenario, I'm not presupposing changing it or going up or down.
Yeah.
In my mind, the scenario would be what happens if we
Go
go
down,
down,
yeah.
what happens
Sure.
if we went up, what happens if we don't apply sensitivity testing.
Yeah. Yeah, we can look at different cap levels.
High is bigger, I think, having still the same high, so we're going to distribute it differently. What's the impact?
Okay. Good.
All right, I think it's slide 71 here. It looks like we're not, right now, on those two bullets, consensus is not doing any major changes on slide 1. Maybe looking at the commuter rail, right? And then count the 2 of the 4.
Yep. Great.
I just had a message that it's sometimes hard to hear me, which I know is true because I have a soft voice, but also your microphone was there. So maybe care if somebody could just do a synopsis, which I'm sure we're going to, but just to make sure our 2 virtual members have our ideas, scenarios.
That's fine. Do we want to?
Want to summarize where we are?
I can try to.
All right, go for it, man.
All right, so on slide 71 here, we listed out a few different scenarios of what we may examine, and what Cindy was saying, that it sounds like we're not going to get into the first two listed that much at this point, which is looking at the sizing metrics for transit agencies, not including VRE, and looking at the metrics and weights for the performance assessment. We're going to mostly concentrate for next month on look at our methodology for commuter rail sizing, and looking at what changes to the 30% cap may have, along with providing some information on what things may look like without a cap at all. And what else in here? I have to look back at my notes. And I think that pretty much covers it. Am I missing any big discussion piece? It sounded like there was not that much interest in kind of not including certain years during the pandemic. And so just kind of see what some of these bigger changes.
And what in the buffer point, should that be a separate point?
Right, and then possibly putting guardrails on the change, an annual change each year. So you could run a formula and say that nobody can, go up or down by more than 25% compared to the previous year or something along those lines.
As a transition,
Yes.
right? COVID disentanglement. No, gee. I was trying to figure out I'm trying to stay employed.
Transition into the formula, and we will transition COVID, but
Yeah. Thinking in terms of what will ultimately go forward with the Commonwealth Transportation Board, my guess is that we're going to say that we still believe that the metrics we've identified for the formula are right, and that they need a chance to be validated through experience. But we also recognize that there are issues related to the impact of COVID on public transit. And that's what we're working through right now. We ultimately will probably suggest some ways to transport CTV that would make sense to deal with or not, and make a recommendation among those.
Well, part of that message, if you're talking about the CTV, I think I would probably work into this, that we think that this also is consistent with our effort, the overall Commonwealth priority of growing our economy, and what do we need to do that, making sure we've got a sound transit system in place, and that will help support that goal as a way of getting to your point about employment. Okay. Just a thought.
Yeah.
Chair, I appreciate that summary. From a technical matter, without making too many scenarios, how can we play some of these sensitivities? So like, we're going to try different paths, but then we're going to do a buffer. Are they standalone or players? I don't want to make it complex, but I also don't want to have not the right enough information to decide which to pick or combine both.
So if I can start with a suggestion, just because I've lived through it last time, I think we start with the individual pieces and look at them from the perspective of the sensitivity. Because some of these things are going to move the needle and some of them aren't. And instead of running a bunch of scenarios where we're combining things, I think the first thing we do is walk through some individual ones and see what it does, and then put together some combinations. And that, I think, will depend on how much we can get through over the next 3 weeks, because that's basically what we have between these meetings to give you a package a week in advance.
I think that makes great sense.
And I wanted to be clear on that and
Yeah.
what our expectations are. So that's very logical.
Yeah.
And I also want to be sensitive to the September timeline when you thought about applying grants.
I would say we are ahead of where I thought we would be at this point. Again, Grant, this is not my baby, but I believe we're ahead of schedule. And so I think if we can pick a few things and run scenarios and bring them back to you for the June meeting, then that positions us well to try to wrap up in time for September. And Vice Chair Mester, earlier you said something about consultants, and last time you saw a lot more consultants and less of DRPT staff. I do want everybody to know we have, in essence, the same consultants available to us this time. What you see is the DRPT staff, because we have excellent technical staff that run the model and are able to do that for us. So,
I think
so
that's
combination.
too, because you guys see the grant applications, you know what the implications are, so you get a quicker read on.
Yeah.
So I appreciate that.
And thank you for
And
the
Mr.
two.
Chair, this is Kate Mattice. I just, so the schedule for when it's important to be bringing questions or whatever, I do know that there was a phasing of when each of these steps, the strategic plan, the capital, and the operating, are we still on track? What's the right timeline? I can't see, for example, that NVTC is going to have formal comments, but if other organizations have comments on this process, and I know VTA will be meeting next month as well, what's the right timing to bring those through TSDAC to DRPT?
So my ideal scenario would be that we would take all three of these items to the CTB, and Dr. Smoot may have other ideas. But my ideal scenario would be to provide a TSDAC update with recommendations on policy changes as one visit to the CTB, not as three individual items.
Okay.
In September. We can take public comments as we go through this process, but we will have to put everything that we change in terms of the CTB policy and for the transit strategic plans, the guidance document, out for public comment, for formal public comment before the CTB takes action, which would be in October, if we go in September for work. So I would say, Kate, you've got a couple of chances. I personally would prefer that if it's something substantive that we try to work with VTA and others through the development of the recommendation to get those comments, and then the formal, obviously, whatever happens in the formal public comment policy, we do this all the time. Lauren manages our trip program. We got a lot of public comment on that. We delayed taking it to the board. We delayed the announcement because we wanted to make sure that we were very thoughtful in responding to the comments. So I do want to make sure that the work of this body is done in time for us to put those documents out and have that public comment period and give us the time to get it back to the board for action before we open grants. So I think I gave you a couple options. If that's not what you're looking for, I'm open to suggestions.
Nope. Got it. Thank you.
In that ideal scenario, when would be the formal public hearing period for October? That is September?
I would say it would probably open, if we do a 6-week public comment period, I would say ideally we would open it mid-August and be done by the end of September. Within 3, is that what we did last time?
We did. Yeah.
Depends on whether we do 30 or 45. I can't remember what the code says specific to this process. But we have to get our board materials in for CTB by the 1st of the month. And so I want to make sure that we, are able to get the comments in and address anything that we may want to change before we get the materials to the CTB or into that review process.
Because if it's mid-August, we've got a June meeting and a July meeting.
Yeah.
Right.
And we want input during that process.
Right.
Representing people, bring that input here.
We also have an August meeting. We have an August meeting on the calendar too. So I mean that, gives us 2 meetings that we can really workshop things, and that August meeting would be like, here's what the draft policy looks like, and it could go out then. I mean, it depends on how the next couple of months go and how deep we want to dig into individual items. If we're open to doing whatever you want to do. Kate says no August. I think that conflicts with her vacation. Mine is after this. So She's laughing. She's now laughing. I'm sorry. Sorry, Kate. I didn't mean to out you. We all like John and Kate's so I think we just need to kind of play it by ear. And you know, if we get to a point where we want to do a longer meeting, we've shortened things up a little bit. If we think we want to do a longer work session, we can do that. Yeah, I think a lot of it's going to depend on Dan and his scenarios and what they look like, and Dan's the center of attention now.
Ideally,
No.
be well served if we can come out of our June meeting with at least the sense of what direction we want to take.
Yeah.
Our June meeting is the 10th. I may have a conflict with the statewide conference, but no hostile person. Unless you all want to come to Virginia Beach.
Have the same drive for me.
Unfortunately, I need to be there.
All right, so does that cover everything we needed to cover with?
I think so. Dan, does that wrap up your?
Yes, it does.
Next step.
Yeah, so.
I think we just talked about
I think we've just wrapped it up, and so.
And how about public comment? Do we have any?
Here, Olivia. So if you want to make a public comment at this point, you can raise your hand in the chat box, or you can type a question in the question box, and we can get back to you. All right.
Seeing none?
Chair, I think.
Are we, anybody have anything else to do with the cause? If not, this meeting.
All right.